Chapter 4: Muslim Slavery and Black Africa. Introduction. As we pointed out in Chapter 1, even though there have been some studies on Muslim slavery, very few have tried to locate slavery in African Muslim societies within its wider Islamic context, and even fewer have made a distinction between African Muslim and indigenous African slavery. This is what this chapter seeks to do. To put the whole discussion in context, we will start by examining the underlying stimuli for slavery within African Muslim societies. Our aim is to demonstrate that slavery in Muslim Africa was not necessarily an indigenous African practice that underwent internal transformations, but had deep and independent roots in the Islamic tradition. We will then go on to examine traditional Muslim ideology relating to the enslavement of Black Africans and the related enigma of racial prejudice in light-skinned Muslim sources and societies. The actual practice of Muslim enslavement of blacks, first outside Black Africa and then within it, will be detailed. This will be followed by an examination of the condition of slaves in Muslim societies. Finally, we will briefly highlight Muslim attitudes towards the abolition of slavery. In all these, we seek to examine the assumptions and myths created over the years that claim that Muslim enslavement was less devastating and less cruel than, say, its transatlantic counterpart. Slavery in Muslim Africa. Indigenous or Islamic stimuli. The discussion of the enslavement of Africans over the years, especially the transatlantic dimension, as one would expect, is fraught with controversies. One major persistent controversy is whether slavery existed in Africa prior to the Christian West and Arab Islamic interludes, and if it did, whether it explains, if not justifies, the traffic of Africans across the Atlantic into Christian Europe and the Americas, and across the Sahara, Red Sea, and Indian Ocean into Muslim North Africa, the Middle East, Turkey, and India. One school of thought that argued that slavery was an age-old and deep-seated practice in Africa, with Africans enslaving one another long before Europeans ever appeared on the scene between the 15th and 19th centuries, apparently originated with European slavers who were making a bid to exonerate themselves on their role in the transatlantic slave trade. What those claims sought to do was to explain, if not justify, the mass enslavement of Africans by Westerners on the grounds that it was the practice of African self-enslavement that brought others into the scene to take part. This line of thinking still persists in more subtle forms. In an acclaimed recent book, Hugh Thomas highlights slavery in Africa and the role of Africans who were neither bullied nor threatened into capturing and supplying their own kind as slaves to Europeans. Some scholars, in response to such innuendos, are known to have taken the other extreme end of the argument. In this regard, there are those who, while not entirely denying the existence of slavery in pre-European Africa, have insisted that the forms of slavery and subjection present in Africa in the 19th and 20th centuries, and considered indigenous to that continent, were in reality engendered by the Atlantic slave trade. In other words, all forms of slavery in 19th century Africa were a direct result of external European demand. Then there are some who, in response to these assertions, question any suggestion that the transformations of slavery in Africa could have had anything to do with the external factors. Suzanne Myers and Igor Kopitov opine that to see the transformations of slavery in Africa as a response to outside stimuli is to deprive the African past of internal economic dynamism, inventiveness, entrepreneurship, and, above all, of its fundamental cultural concepts of rights in persons. In other words, the transformations of slavery in Africa, including the large-scale raiding of the 18th and 19th centuries, could, or rather would, have arisen with or without any external stimulus, such as European or Arab Muslim activities. Both these positions are hardly sustainable. First of all, the argument that all forms of slavery that existed in 19th century Africa were a direct result of the transatlantic slave trade seems to deny the historical fact that slavery in most parts of Muslim Africa, such as the Savannah Belt of West Africa and the East African coast, had little, if anything, to do with the Atlantic trade. The generalization of slavery in Africa confuses slavery in Muslim Africa and that of traditional African societies. The thesis of Mears and Kopitov, on the other hand, falls into the same trap. They have outlined slavery in both Muslim and non-Muslim Africa under the general theme of African slavery. But as we shall shortly argue, slavery as practiced by African Muslim communities was not necessarily the same as slavery in traditional African societies. Apart from the generalizations both theses have fallen victim of, the views expressed by Mears and Kopitov have two basic difficulties. First of all, by rights in persons, they claim that slavery in Africa was just another process like marriage or adoption, whereby outsiders were incorporated into a kin group in exchange for wealth. But to compare wives or adopted persons in Africa with slaves is a gross misrepresentation of these institutions in indigenous Africa, to say the least, and an undeserved deferential treatment of slavery. Second, that African slavery could or would have escalated with or without external stimulus is at best an intellectual speculation that can only be consigned to the realms of the big ifs of history. The question not answered by such speculations, though, is why the ancient slave systems of Europe and Asia did not escalate to the extent their African counterpart did. Similar claims and innuendos have been advanced in relation to the oldest, most systematized, and unparalleled form of enslaving Africans, i.e., the Arab-Islamic dimension of slavery. Claims that slavery was deep-rooted and widespread in pre-Islamic Africa, and that Africans actively enslaved and traded their own kind, long before the introduction of Islam into Africa, have been advanced in a bid to explain, excuse, and justify Arab-Muslim involvement in the enslavement of Africans. In this regard, the Fishers, writing on slavery in Muslim Africa, caution thus: the fact that the institution of slavery, in one form or another, had deep roots in many parts of Africa long before Islam became a significant social influence there, and that even in regions which were thoroughly Islamized there were many pre-Islamic survivals, demonstrates how misleading it would be to suggest a hard and fast distinction between Muslim and traditional slavery. The Fishers do not provide evidence for their claim that slavery had deep roots in many parts of pre-Islamic Africa. Fadel Abdallah, who sets out to defend Islam against self-righteous criticism by Western scholars, on his part quotes the above statement of the Fishers and counsels that, for a discussion of slavery within the context of Islam in Africa, there is always the difficulty of determining how much arises from the original Islamic teachings and how much from local African custom. Abdallah goes on to assert that Africans were active slave trade agents both at the individual level and at the official level before the introduction of Islam in the 7th century. Again, no evidence whatsoever is provided to back the claim that Africans were active slave trading agents before the introduction of Islam. Abdallah, all the same, lets out the underlying motive of such assertions thus: suppose that the institution of slavery did not exist in Africa before the presence of Islam. Was it then possible for Islam to impose and enforce slavery upon the African society? The answer to this question is a categorical no. What Abdallah is suggesting here is that Islam could not and did not introduce any new ideas into any society, not least Africa. Of course, this is an absurd suggestion, for Islam did introduce new ideas into the African worldview, including the age-old practice of slavery, as will be made clear shortly. To begin with, there can be no questioning the reality of active and indeed crucial participation and complicity, and therefore responsibility, in the part that Africans played as suppliers of the human commodity to the Western Christian and Arab Islamic worlds. This is a hard historical fact that Africans have to confront and address. Denying this fact is in no one's interest, not least the African. The African role in slavery within the Arab-Islamic dimension, which is our primary concern here, will be made clear in the course of this chapter. At the same time, it is strange, to say the least, to attempt to explain and justify the part played by people who regard themselves as believers with a higher level of civilization out to convert and civilize pagan and barbaric Africans on the pretext that slavery had deep roots in African societies. It has to be said that it is more than probable that slavery existed in Africa long before the emergence of both the Arab-Islamic and Western Christian interludes. Slavery in one form or another has been in existence from time immemorial. It existed in all the ancient civilizations of Asia, the Middle East, Europe, and pre-Columbian America. That ancient African civilization, such as Egypt and other societies, share this general human phenomenon, cannot therefore be denied. With regards to ancient sub-Saharan Africa, it is known from literary and legal sources of private landlords that some wealthy and powerful individuals had slaves. Studies on the nature of ancient slavery in general, Africa included, reveal that, with the exception of large-scale use of slaves in such civilizations as Greece, Rome, and Egypt, slaves were generally owned by a few powerful and wealthy individuals in all classical and pre-classical societies. It was never an institutionalized system. Under such circumstances, and in the absence of hard historical evidence, claims that slavery was deep-rooted in ancient Africa and that Africans actively traded other Africans in pre-Islamic times are exaggerations, if not mere assertions, to assuage Western Christian and Arab Islamic guilt and responsibility. The scanty allusions to slavery in ancient Africa and surmises from more detailed studies of slavery in pre-European, non-Muslim African societies suggest that slavery in classical and pre-classical African societies, allowing for differences in detail, shared most of the characteristics of domestic slavery in other ancient societies as those mentioned above. Possible abuses here and there included. Studies on slavery in such non-Muslim African societies as the Sena of Mozambique, the Batswana of Botswana, the Karebe of Tanzania, the Ibangala of Angola, Ibo of Nigeria, and Sherbro of Sierra Leone all reveal this trend. These characteristics include the fact that a few individuals, mainly the ruling elite of the more organized and powerful kingdoms within the pre-European, non-Muslim African context, owned slaves more as conspicuous examples of wealth and authority than as a labor force. In line with domestic slavery in other ancient societies, within the less specialized economies of non-Muslim Africa, slaves could add to the size of the population, but performed virtually the same functions as lineage members, and therefore did not form a distinct stratum or class apart. Hence, slavery in traditional African societies has been described as one of many types of dependency and incidental to the structure of society and the functioning of the economy. We agree with P.E. Lovejoy that if we mean by slave people who were kidnapped, seized in war, or condemned to be sold as a result of crime or in compensation for crime, then slaves they were. Structurally, however, slavery was marginal. First of all, to say slavery is a type of dependency in traditional Africa is different from suggesting that slaves in traditional African societies were quasi-kinsmen and kinsmen quasi-slaves, as suggested by Mies and Kopitov. They are of the opinion that slaves in Africa stood in the continuum of marginality, whose progressive reduction led in the direction of quasi-kinship and, finally, kinship. In other words, according to the position taken by Mies and Kopitov, slavery in traditional Africa was a process rather than a status. Hence, they use slaves and slavery in inverted commas throughout. Apart from the mistaken assumption that all, or at least most, slaves eventually became kin, by referring to slaves as quasi-kin, it is like referring to a child as a quasi-adult because he or she is an adult in the making. Second, To say slavery was a type of dependency does not necessarily imply that slavery in these societies was benign. Indeed, slaves within certain traditional African societies were in some cases killed for sacrificial purposes or buried along with nobles. But even under these circumstances, slaves did not suffer this fate necessarily because of their slave status, even though some abuses in later times cannot be denied. In some African societies, slaves were, for instance, buried along with nobles, just as were other relatives such as wives, children, etc., in line with the belief in ancestors and the need for dependence in both the living and ancestral worlds. Another important feature of slavery in pre-European, non-Muslim Africa, with the exception of those areas such as Bambara in West Africa and Nyamwezi in East Africa, that shared borders with or were in some form of relation to neighboring or powerful Muslim states and people, is that there is hardly any known evidence of raids with the specific aim of acquiring slaves. In this regard, an Ashanti ruler is reported to have said, "I cannot make war to catch slaves in the bush like a thief. My ancestors never did so." Slaves were mainly captives of war, augmented through sale, mainly though not exclusively of criminals and victims of insolvency. These forms of slavery differed from the institutionalized and specialized systems that pertained in the Christian West and in the Muslim world, as will be demonstrated shortly, where slaves were used extensively in production, the monopoly of political power, and domestic servitude, including sexual services. The latter situation, as pointed out by P.E. Lovejoy, required a regular supply of slaves, either through trade or enslavement or both, and the number of slaves in society became significant enough to affect its organization, and even more importantly, were backed by a systemic religious ideology. There is therefore no evidence that the practice of slavery in ancient Africa was any more deep-rooted or widespread than it was in other ancient European, Middle Eastern, and Asian societies. Concerning the sale or purchase of slaves from Africa, literary and archaeological evidence shows that while the trans-Saharan trade flourished during the time of ancient Greece and Carthage, slaves were hardly among the commodities exchanged with Africans. Only after Rome replaced Carthage in 202 BC, where a few black slaves found in North Africa, a single epigram indicates the import of an individual slave of sub-Saharan origin. While these bits of evidence reinforce the point that slavery in one form or another probably existed in Africa and that blacks were enslaved, the evidence in itself suggests that the traffic of Africans as slaves at that time was incidental and unusual. The Greek periplus, written probably around the early 2nd century CE, gives an indication that the export of African slaves had by then become a major business. Arabs are said to have been exporting the better sort of slaves to Egypt in increasing numbers from Somaliland. While the exact role played by Africans themselves in this trade is not immediately clear, the localized nature of the escalation still makes it unusual within the wider African context, thereby suggesting direct and/or indirect external Arab agency as the possible stimulus. What is more, this information does not tell us about the nature of slavery in ancient Africa. However, between the 15th and 19th centuries, slavery in non-Muslim areas along the West and Central African coast was significantly transformed from a structurally marginal feature of society into an institutionalized and well-organized economic venture, leading to an increase in the capture and sale of slaves. Those transformed societies were those who were in direct contact with European trade. Herein lies the crux of the matter. The question, therefore, is how do we explain the apparent transformations of slavery in those parts of non-Muslim Africa during this particular period? This could not have been a mere coincidence due to internal African economic dynamism, inventiveness, and entrepreneurship. If the Ashanti ruler's claim, quoted above, is anything to go by, and unless there is evidence to the contrary, such transformations are mainly, if not solely explained by the impact of European trade. European trade included the supply of guns and gunpowder to their African trading partner communities and states, which in turn exacerbated prevailing precarious situations. These brought in their wake wars and their attendant instability, insecurity, and famine, all potential sources of slaves, coupled with the insatiable demand for slaves for the New World. Commenting on the transformation of slavery among the Igbo of Nigeria, V.C. Uchendu writes, "There is good evidence that when slavery became a profitable business, as a result of the demand for slaves in the New World, the incidence of warfare and slave raids increased. In other words, European demand determined African supply. After all, is it not a basic economic principle that demand determines supply and not the other way around? European demand for the human commodity not only increased African supply, but it influenced the use to which slaves were put in powerful African kingdoms, such as Ashanti, transforming slavery from a marginal feature of society into an elaborate institution. That the large-scale African supply and usage of slaves was a direct result of external involvement is supported by the fact that in the drive to abolish slavery and the slave trade, the main targets were European and Arab ships in the Atlantic and Indian Oceans and caravans across the Sahara, rather than traders in the thickets of Ashanti or Dahomey. Generally speaking, the abolition of slavery in non-Muslim Africa involved the negotiation of anti-slavery treaties with the colonial powers. And when the abolitionists managed to stop or drastically reduce the external European and Arab Muslim outlets, slavery in non-Muslim African societies, unlike Muslim societies, as will become apparent later in this chapter, withered away and died a natural death. Surely, a deep-rooted and widespread practice could not have died out so quickly to the extent that mere mention of the subject became a taboo in non-Muslim African communities. Hence, between the extreme positions that slavery in Africa was a result of an external stimulus, i.e., transatlantic trade on the one hand, and the view that the transformations of slavery from isolated domestic use to institutional plantation slavery was due to internal dynamics on the other, therefore, lies the more thoughtful view that though slavery existed in Africa long before European trade, the latter was the main contributory factor to the dramatic transformations of the practice in some non-Muslim African societies, mainly those that were in contact with this activity. P. E. Lovejoy points out that one important result of European trade was the consolidation of a distinctively non-Muslim form of slavery. Slavery, in some non-Muslim African societies, underwent a transformation from a marginal feature of society to an important institution. With regard to most parts of Muslim Africa, however, long before the Europeans ever appeared on the scene, slavery was a well-organized and institutionalized system. These include such Muslim states and dynasties as Sokoto, Bornu, Wadai, Darfur, Sennar, and Futa Jalon, all in West and Central Sudan, while in East Africa, slavery and the slave trade was virtually an Arab-Muslim monopoly, with the Yao and Nyamwezi as active middlemen and suppliers. It is this dimension of slavery in Muslim Africa that most scholars have studied as part of African slavery, as pointed out in Chapter 1. The question that we seek to address briefly here is to what extent the practice of enslavement in Muslim Africa was indigenous, and to what extent it was not, and therefore Islamic. The most fundamental difference that sets slavery in Muslim Africa apart from non-Muslim Africa can be found in the justification of the practice. Muslims right across ethnic, racial, and geographical boundaries, like the Christian West, had a systematic religious and racist justification for enslavement. As we shall demonstrate in the next section, the main justification of slavery in classical Muslim thought, borne out in practice by generations of Muslims, is non-belief in Islam, kufr. The basis for Arab Islamic ideology of enslavement includes, of course, the Quran, prophetic traditions, the legal codes, according to the various madhabib, such as the Maliki in West Africa, and a corpus of literary works written and commented upon by eminent Muslims from the heartland of the Muslim world. This is not to say that Muslim ideology on enslavement, or for that matter any other issue, was uniformly understood and applied by Muslims down the ages. The haphazard application of Islamic prescriptions on slavery by African Muslims, though, was in no way unique and should not be seen as a basis for regarding African Muslim slavery as non-Islamic. It shall be demonstrated in this chapter that while African Muslims exploited slavery to satisfy mundane economic needs, they also, in line with traditional Muslim thought, sincerely regarded it as an Islamic response to the problem of kufr. The raids, slaughter, kidnapping, trade, and enslavement of millions of traditional African believers by African Muslim societies, as we shall shortly outline, was basically viewed as a religious duty. Concerning the ideological and religious basis of Muslim slavery in general, and enslavement in Muslim Africa in particular, there are those who maintain that slavery was a deeply rooted pre-Islamic practice, independent of, and indeed antithetical to the teachings of Islam. Muslim, African, and non-African slavers alike were therefore either ignorant or wrong in their understanding of Islamic teaching. Fadel Abdallah, for instance, claims that everything in Islam in relation to slavery was intended to eliminate an existing, disagreeable, and deep-rooted institution, and insists throughout his article that slavery persisted in Muslim society because of deviation from Islam. That is an internal Muslim debate. However, notwithstanding variations in applications, to claim that slavery is a disagreeable institution in Islam begs the question, which Islam? As far as the evidence available to us is concerned, Muslim slavery, including that of African Muslims, had a single source, i.e., Arab Islam, as those generations of Muslims perceived, practiced, and lived it. Hence, slavery, as perceived and practiced by African Muslims, had more in common with their Muslim counterparts in other parts of the Muslim world than it had with their traditional African compatriots. Slavery in Muslim Africa is therefore not a good example of an independent African counterpart of the transatlantic dimension. It is Muslim slavery in Africa and not African Muslim slavery. For, as honestly acknowledged by a few individual Muslims, in bringing Islam to Black Africa, Arabs introduced a new meaning to the concept of slavery, as they did to many other institutions and practices. Surely, there are those who have maintained that Africans had the tendency to corrupt pure Islamic teachings, and so would suspect that slavery in African Muslim societies must have been corrupted with pagan survivals. H.J. Fisher, for example, is not immune from this, and it is in this connection that the Fisher's caution against making a hard and fast distinction between slavery in Muslim and non-Muslim Africa should be understood. Nevertheless, the caution is not completely without merit. For instance, it has to be borne in mind that some of the uses of slaves, for example as domestic menials, cut across cultural, geographical, ideological, and religious boundaries. So does the whole status of slaves. Slaves are slaves, irrespective of whether they are under a Muslim or traditional African master. However, in addition to the ideological basis for Muslim slavery, there are important characteristics that distinguish slavery in traditional African societies from the institutionalized model of Muslim slavery. Indeed, the Fishers themselves, after cautioning against making hard and fast distinctions, went on to submit that the general pattern of slavery in the Muslim countries of tropical Africa can fairly easily be recognized as different from that in areas unaffected by Islam. This is precisely the point we are seeking to draw attention to and to underscore. The differences include the institutionalization of slavery, the scale of slave concentration, and the uses of slaves in administration, as sexual objects and in large-scale production ventures, as was the case within such Islamic-inspired dynasties mentioned above long before the European interlude. Regarding slave concentration, for instance, The Fischers, who based their study of slavery in Africa on the accounts of Gustav Nachtigal, a German physician who explored various parts of the interior of Africa between 1869 and 1874, submitted that in contrast to his numerous references to the number of slaves in Muslim societies, there was next to nothing to be said about the number of slaves held by pagan masters in his accounts. This does not, of course, mean that such non-Muslim African societies did not own slaves. Neither are we suggesting that the lack of such evidence is proof that slavery did not exist in pre-Islamic Africa. What it does mean, though, is that for Nachtigal, with such a keen interest in slavery as manifested throughout his accounts, not to have said anything about slavery in non-Muslim areas, as he did extensively with regard to Muslim areas, notwithstanding how little his contact with non-Muslim people was as compared to Muslim communities, suggests that the practice was, at least, less obvious. Thus our suggestion above, that there are good and tangible reasons why slavery in African Muslim societies cannot be regarded as African, at least without significant qualifications. Slave raiding and slave trading, which were virtually unknown in pre-European African non-Muslim societies, were a common practice in Muslim societies. The long tradition of Muslim slave raids and slave trade in West Africa intensified during the period of the jihad movements. If one is to speak of slavery as a deep-rooted and widespread practice in African societies, it was in Muslim rather than non-Muslim societies. This is evident from colonial anti-slavery policies in Africa. European colonial powers everywhere recognized that, unlike pagan societies, slavery was at the heart of the religious, cultural, and economic lives of Muslim societies, and that it had to be tackled with all the sensitivity and expediency it deserved. A British colonial officer captured the spirit of European anti-slavery policies in African Muslim societies in the early 20th century when he commented, "Not only is the holding of slaves legal by religion and long usage in these territories, but the sudden discontinuance of the system would produce an enormous dislocation of all social conditions. The owner, who is dependent on his slaves for the cultivation of his estates and for every form of his wealth, would be impoverished by their loss, and the slaves themselves, though not immediately, would to a great extent fall into idle habits and bring about a general economic loss." F. L. Shaw, wife of Lord Lugard, Colonial High Commissioner of Northern Nigeria, argued for a gradual rather than sudden enforcement of abolition in 20th century Northern Nigeria in the following words: "The fact has to be faced by the administrator in Mohammedan Africa that the abolition of slavery is not a straightforward task of beneficence. It carries with it grave and undeniable disadvantages to the slaves as well as to their owners, and the objections urged against it by the local rulers and employers are not by any means without foundation." William Wallace, acting as High Commissioner of Northern Nigeria, on his part wrote, "I am in complete touch and sympathy with the semi-civilized Muslim peoples of the Hausa states, and I can assure you most positively that if a policy of wholesale liberation of domestic slaves is pursued, it will mean the ruin of this protectorate at no distant date." As a result, slave raiding and trading were banned, but the legal status of slavery in Muslim territories, as opposed to pagan territories, was recognized and indeed sanctioned under colonial law on religious, economic, and social grounds. In Zanzibar, for instance, the British, in recognition of Muslim and native customary laws, ruled that non-Muslims could not legally own slaves, but that a Muslim could, upon appeal to Muslim law. Particularly striking distinctions in slave concentration and the socio-economic and religious importance of slavery between the Muslim Maraka and their traditional Bambara cousins in the Senegambia have also been noted. The Maraka and Bambara example is particularly important, not least because both spoke the same language, lived in the same ecological zone, and shared the same social formation. The differences in slave concentration and socio-economic and religious importance between traditional Bambara and their Muslim cousins, typifies the difference between traditional African societies and their Muslim counterparts in general. Indeed, regarding slave concentration and the institutionalization of slavery on the whole, Muslim states and communities in Africa have an unrivaled record throughout Africa as compared to their traditional counterparts. Studies on slavery in such non-Muslim states as Ashanti, Dahomey, Oyo, Bambara, the Kong, etc., between the 16th and 19th centuries, the factor of European trade notwithstanding, show that internal slave holdings in those areas were far less than such Muslim areas as Sokoto, Bornu, Wadai, Darfur, Sennar, Futa Jalon, etc. Unlike traditional kingdoms, slave raiding was an organized state enterprise in virtually all the Muslim domains mentioned above. Indigenous peasant African societies were sources of slaves for Muslim and European slavers, and their African political and trading allies, rather than slave owners. Hence, those within the savannah areas of West Africa have been described as more a source of slaves for neighboring Muslim states than employers of slaves. How then are the distinguishable patterns of slavery in African Muslim societies noted above, as compared to their non-Muslim counterparts, to be explained? Many factors such as sociological, economic and historical ones can, and have been, adduced to account for slavery in African Muslim societies as they have been in other slave-owning societies. Important and crucial as these factors are, however, the underlying factors of systemic religious and racist ideologies substantially affected slavery in Muslim Africa and explain its distinguishing characteristics. Any denial or minimizing of the religious and hence Arab-Islamic motivation and stimulus for slavery in African Muslim societies is to deny something African Muslims stood, fought, and died for, namely that slavery was an important part of their religious life. Our contention, therefore, is that slavery in African Muslim societies underwent significant transformations. First of all, as a direct result of contracts with the Arab-Islamic world and the insatiable demand for slaves by those Muslim states and communities. In addition to this, like the transformation of slavery in non-Muslim African societies that were in contact with European trade, non-Muslim African states that shared borders with Muslim kingdoms or had some form of relations, either as a tributary or subordinate states to Muslim governments, developed a more institutionalized slave system, not on the same level with their Muslim neighbors, but in many significant ways different from other traditional African communities. Examples of these non-Muslim African states and communities include the traditional Segu Bambara state and numerous other Sudanese tribes of West Africa, and the Yao and Nyamwezi of East Africa. These non-Muslim African societies embarked on slave raiding and slave trading, mainly with their Muslim neighbors, middlemen or overlords, first as an economic venture, but then also to pay tribute to their Muslim overlords. These developments in non-Muslim African society consequently transformed slavery from incidental enslavement of individuals to extensive employment of slave labor in local industries. Hence, stronger non-Muslim tribes started raiding weaker tribes to sell to Muslim slavers, employ in local economies, or pay tribute to Muslim overlords. The earliest example of non-Muslim states paying tribute in the form of slaves to Muslim overlords is contained in the Pact, signed in the 7th century between Arab Muslim rulers of Egypt and Nubia, which involved the payment of 360 slaves a year by Nubia to their Muslim overlords. This agreement lasted and tribute was paid on a fairly regular basis up to the 13th century. The practice of non-Muslim people paying tribute in the form of slaves to Muslim overlords was adopted and duplicated by Muslim rulers in Africa, especially during the jihadist rule in Western Sudan in the 19th and 20th centuries. So both the commercial and political links and ties between Muslims and non-Muslim states transformed slavery in non-Muslim African societies by way of introducing slave raids and slave trade, hitherto unknown in the histories of these non-Muslim societies. Our second contention is that the Arab Islamic stimulus was, however, in other crucial ways different from that of the Christian West. While there was hardly any internalization of European attitudes to slavery and its ideology in Africa, African Muslim societies adopted the Arab Islamic ideological basis of enslavement. African converts to Islam imbibed and internalized the religious motivation and justification of enslavement, along with many other Islamic teachings. The Arab Islamic ideology of enslavement became the main stimulus and reference point for the institution of slavery in African Muslim communities. As far as we are concerned, this is the fundamental distinguishing feature of African Muslim slavery from that of their non-Muslim counterparts. This will become abundantly clear as we proceed to outline slavery in African Muslim societies. Some people may accuse us of a fundamental logical flaw in our presentation, given that we have argued in Chapter 2 that the host indigenous African societies and their worldview had a profound influence on the Muslim guests, and yet want to exempt the institution and practice of slavery from that influence. First of all, any such accusation along those lines will be a gross misrepresentation of what we have intimated in Chapter 2. We never said, or even implied, that the influence was only one way. If anything at all, it is the spokespersons of Arab Islam who have sought to paint a picture of a one-way influence, with the literate traditions of Islam having the initiative and upper hand over non-literate traditions of indigenous Africa. As far as we are concerned, the borrowings, exchanges, and influences were mutual. Second, accusations of logical flaws presume that everything, including historical events, followed and must be fitted into a certain mechanical process and therefore must come out with a logical result. This is a certainly false assumption, especially when we are dealing with encounters and exchanges such as those that took place between host traditions in general, not only African traditions, and the incoming traditions of Islam and Christianity. Third, traditional African societies influenced their Muslim guests with what they had within the framework of the indigenous worldview. And as we have argued above, slavery as an institution, backed by a systemic ideology, religious or otherwise, is alien to pre-Islamic and pre-Western African societies. So surely traditional communities could not have influenced their Muslim guests on things they had never knew of in the first place. It should be added here that what we have argued and established with regards to the Islamic stimulus for the transformation of slavery from a marginal social phenomena to a wide-scale, institutionalized practice does not pertain only to African societies. Similar observations have been made on the transformation of slavery in Turkish society. Robert Brunswick writes, "Throughout the whole of Islamic history, down to the 19th century, slavery has always been an institution tenacious of life and deeply rooted in custom. The Turks, who were to come to the relief of the Arabs in the victorious struggle against Christianity, seem to have practiced it but little in their primitive nomadic state. After providing for so long their unwilling quota, through kidnapping or purchase, to the slave class of the Muslim world, they became themselves supporters of the institution in an ever-increasing degree, as they adopted Islam and the sedentary way of life. This is precisely what we are saying about the Islamic stimulus for the transformation of slavery in African societies. First, that Africans seem to have practiced slavery but little in their pre-Islamic state. Second, that African societies who were themselves victims of Arab Muslim enslavement became the principal supporters and agents of the institution in an ever-increasing degree as they got into alliances with their Muslim neighbors and/or overlords, and more so as they adopted Islam completely or even nominally. We shall now proceed to demonstrate that slavery has always been an institution tenacious of life and deeply rooted in Muslim thought and way of life, right from the Islamic heartlands of Arabia down to Muslim Africa, by giving an overview of Islamic justification of enslavement and the Muslim practice of slavery from the Islamic heartlands to Muslim Africa. Classical Muslim ideology of enslavement. In pre-Islamic times, slavery was well known in the whole of the Mediterranean region and the Arabian Peninsula. Slaves were mainly captured during wars. This pre-Islamic practice, like many others, is accepted in classical Muslim traditions as a matter of course. In the Quran, the periphrasis, "those whom your right hand possesses," is used more frequently to refer to slaves than abid, plural of abd, the Arabic term for slave. In the language of the Quran, slaves are a legitimate property for Muslims. The Quran accepts and endorses the basic inequality between master and slave as part of the divinely established order, and uses this inequality as a metaphor to depict the difference between God and His creation. In Surah 16:75, the Quran castigates Meccan polytheism in the following words: Allah coineth a similitude, on the one hand, a mere chattel slave, who hath control of nothing, and, on the other hand, one on whom we have bestowed a fair provision from us, and he spendeth thereof secretly and openly. Are they equal? Praise be to Allah, but most of them know not. The pre-Islamic Arab practice of using female slaves as prostitutes is condemned by the Quran, which instead sanctions the institution of concubinage, which permits a Muslim male to have lawful conjugal relations with an unrestricted number of his female slaves. Any Muslim who cannot afford to marry a free Muslim woman may take his female slave as a wife. The Quran urges, without actually commanding, kindness to slaves as a meritorious act of piety. In the same way, it recommends, without requiring, their liberation by purchase or manumission, to which the legal arms of zakat may be devoted, or by the slaves buying their own freedom. In the event of a Muslim willfully breaking the fast during Ramadan, committing unintentional homicide or perjury, the Quran prescribes, among other things, the freeing of a Muslim slave as expiation. The Hadith generally follow the Quranic pattern of accepting slavery, urging kindness and recommending manumission as acts of piety. Slavery as a practice is therefore not condemned in either the Quran or Hadith. If anything at all, the practice is endorsed with modifications and stipulations aimed at regulating and mitigating possible abuses. But these are only the theories and pious stipulations, which do not in any way suggest a reflection of what actually took place in practice, as some people would have us believe. Non-belief in Islam as justification for Muslim slavery. The traditional Muslim ideology of slavery is closely linked to the doctrine of military jihad. Just as jihad is directed against non-belief in Islam, kufr, so the unbelievers, kuffar, captured in a jihad are the legally and religiously enslavable in Muslim society. The Quran, in this regard, admonishes Muslims thus: when you meet the unbelievers in a jihad, smite their necks, then, when you have made wide slaughter among them, tie fast the bonds of slavery. The victorious Muslim ruler could then choose either to free his captives out of generosity, presumably after their conversion to Islam, or in exchange for a ransom. The choice of freeing captives or exchanging them for ransom did not, of course, rule out the possession of captives as slaves. In fact, both in theory and practice, enslavement of captives was a general norm, while the freeing and exchange of captives remained important exceptions. Taking exception to Muslim apologists such as MC Ali, who insist that it is a false accusation against the Quran that it allows enslavement of the captives of war. H. Goraba accepts the Quranic position and offers his own explanation. In Goraba's view, Islam allowed prisoners of war to be enslaved because Muslims had to fight people who enslaved them when captured. If Islam had refused to allow Muslims the right claimed by their enemies, writes Goraba, it would have put the Muslims at an unfair disadvantage in their wars. Hence, it is logical and just that Islam gave the ruler of the Muslims the right to act in the same manner as their enemies. Here we have the modern apologetic and traditional views, succinctly summed up by these two Muslim scholars. There are therefore two main sources of slaves in Islam: capture in jihad or birth to slave parents. The latter means one inherits the servile status of one's slave ancestors until or unless one is manumitted through one of the above-mentioned processes. So once captured and enslaved, conversion to Islam offers no escape route for a slave or a slave's offspring. Fiqh, a traditional Muslim law, recognizes purchase as a third legitimate source of acquiring slaves. In practice, however, raiding and kidnapping by Muslim individuals and communities became popular sources of slaves. Since legitimate jihad is only permitted against non-Muslims, and jihad is the main lawful source of slaves, only non-Muslims, especially idolaters, can be enslaved by Muslims. A medieval Muslim jurist, Abd al-Aziz ibn Ahmad al-Bukhari, died 1330, sums up the traditional Muslim justification of enslavement thus: servitude is a vestige of obstinacy in refusing to believe in the one God, kufr, and this in the eyes of the law is death itself. Hence, in traditional Muslim law, as J.R. Willis points out, slavery becomes a simile for the heathen condition, a symbolic representation of the very antithesis of Islam. And if a slave is hewn out of this simile of this heathenness, it is submission to Islam which hones the possibilities for redemption. Thus, non-belief is the signal cause of possession, the underlying principle for the very existence of slavery in Islam. In line with this notion, traditional Muslim jurisprudence sanctions the enslavement of Jews and Christians, but, rather curiously, excludes non-Muslim Arabs from the category of the enslavable. There is also a general consensus in traditional Muslim jurisprudence that women and children are not to be killed in a jihad, but rather taken and divided as booty among the victors as slaves. Al-Maghili's admonition in this regard, pre-echoed in all the legal texts, reads as follows: make jihad against the infidels, kill their men, make captive their women and children, seize their wealth. By sanctioning the enslavement of women and children as booty, alongside livestock and other movable properties, traditional Islamic thought regards slavery as the means, on the one hand, of dealing with the antithesis of Islam, kufr, and on the other hand, of compensating for Muslim losses in jihad as well, as a motivation for jihad. In theory, no Muslim is permitted under traditional Muslim law to enslave a fellow Muslim. This was hardly the case in practice though, both in Muslim Africa and in the heartland of the Islamic world. If one converts to Islam after being captured in a jihad or purchased, that does not change one's fate, nor that of one's offspring. A 15th century Islamic legal edict reads: if it is proven that a slave was originally an unbeliever of one kind or another, unless he is of Quraysh, Muhammad's clan, and if on the other hand it is not proven that he adopted Islam when he was on his own country and a free agent, then once his captors have laid hands on him after conquest and victory, it is lawful for them to sell or buy him without hindrance. The profession of the monotheistic creed by these slaves does not prevent the continuance of their status as slaves. In other words, the status of slavery is permanent. E.W. Blyden was, therefore, ill-informed both in theory and in practice when he asserted that in Islam, the slave who becomes a Mohammedan is free. Black Africa, considered the bastion of unbelief, became a major source of slaves from Muslim lands such as North Africa, the Middle East, Turkey, and South Asia, starting as early as the 7th century. As will be pointed out in the following pages, within Black Africa itself, Muslims, through the waging of jihad, raiding, kidnapping, and purchase, reduced millions of traditional African believers into slavery on account of their non-belief in Islam. Ahmad Baba, 1556 to 1627, a celebrated Muslim alim of Timbuktu, wrote an important treatise popularly known as the Miraj, in which he spelt out the non-Muslim people in the Western Sudan against whom legitimate jihad could be undertaken and who could be enslaved. In his treatise, which became a standard reference for the categories of the enslavable in the Western Sudan, Ahmad Baba declared that the reason for slavery in Islam is non-belief, and went on to rule that those who come to you from the following clans, the Mossi, the Gurma, the Busa, the Yorko, the Kutukul, the Yoruba, Tangbuku, Dogon of the hills, the Bobo, are considered non-believers who still adhere to non-belief until now. Also Kunbe, except a few from Hanba and Da Anaka, although their Islam is weak. You are allowed to own all these without questioning. This is the ruling about these clans, and Allah, the Highest, knows and judges. Muslims, like their Western Christian counterparts centuries later, regarded the enslavement of black Africans as a blessing in disguise to the victims. Black slaves, it was believed, were fortunate in that they were spared the barbarities of their own kind, and even more so because they were destined to be introduced to the religion and civilized values of Islam. In a famous, albeit weak hadith, the Prophet of Islam is alleged to have said, "Will you not ask me why I laugh? I have seen people of my community who are dragged to paradise against their will." They asked, "O Prophet of God, who are they?" He said, "They are the non-Arab people whom the warriors in the Holy War have captured and made to enter Islam." The same notion is portrayed in the Persian tale where Muslim traders took advantage of the hospitality of an African ruler, abducted him, and sold him into slavery. The ruler was then taken to Basra in Iraq, converted to Islam in the process, then managed to escape some years later back to Africa. Then, the tale continues, these same traders happen to come back to the same place, only to meet the same man in power. The ruler, instead of raging with revenge towards his abductors, pardoned and thanked them for making it possible for him to be introduced to the religion and values of Islam. In the ruler's own alleged words, "I am glad and satisfied with the grace which God has accorded me and mine, instructing us in the precepts of Islam, the true faith, in the usage of prayer, fasting and pilgrimage, and in the knowledge of what is forbidden and what is allowed. None other in the land of the Zinj has received such favor. And if I pardon you, it was because you were first cause of the purity of my faith." It was with this incredible notion that slavery was a blessing in disguise for the victims, especially black African victims, that millions of black Africans were reduced to slavery by various Muslim communities within and without the continent in the past 14 centuries of Islamic history. Color and race in the Muslim ideology of slavery. Another crucial feature of the classical Muslim ideology of enslavement is that blacks became legitimate slaves by virtue of the color of their skin. The justification of the early Muslim equation of blackness with servitude was found in the Genesis story popularly called the Curse of Ham, one of Noah's sons. The biblical version describes how Noah got drunk and lay uncovered inside his tent. His younger son, Ham, saw his father's nakedness and informed his two elder brothers, Shem and Japheth. These two laid a garment over their shoulders and walked backwards into the tent and covered their father. Noah woke up and, upon hearing what happened, cursed the descendants of Ham's son, Canaan, to be slaves to the descendants of Shem and Japheth. The biblical curse of servitude, not blackness, fell on the youngest son of Ham, Canaan, and not his other sons, including Cush, who was later projected in Judeo-Christian traditions as the ancestor of blacks. Apparently transmitted to Muslims by Jews, Christians, and converts from Judaism and Christianity, the story found its way into early Muslim Arab historiography and ethnology. All the Muslim Arab versions portray Arabs as descendants of Shem, and blacks, sometimes including Copts and Berbers, and the Sindh of India, as descendants of Ham, with most assigning the Turks and Slavs to Japheth. In the Muslim Arab versions, blacks are condemned to be slaves and menials. Arabs are blessed to be prophets and nobles, while Turks and Slavs are destined to be kings and tyrants. In early and medieval Muslim sources, the link between Ham and blacks was fully forged, and blackness became a simile for the servile condition, a clear departure from the Judeo-Christian version of the myth. Al-Tabari, the great Muslim historian, cited not less than 6 prophetic traditions to support the Arab-Muslim version of the descendants and fates of the 3 sons of Noah. One such tradition reads, Ham begat all those who are black and curly-haired, while Japheth begat all those who are full-faced with small eyes, and Shem begat everyone who is handsome of face with beautiful hair. Noah prayed that the hair of Ham's descendants would not grow beyond their ears, and that wherever his descendants met the children of Shem, the latter would enslave them. On this part, Ibn Qutaybah, 828 to 889, wrote that Ham, son of Noah, was light-skinned and handsome. Then God Most High changed his complexion and that of his progeny into black because of the curse invoked by his father. Thus, the biblical curse that originally fell on the youngest son of Ham, Canaan, in Arab Muslim versions of the myth, falls on Ham himself, whose descendants are cursed not only with servitude, but in addition, with the change of their color from light-skinned to black. Therefore, just as kufr is a synonym for servitude in classical Muslim thought, the color black became the most obvious sign of servitude in light-skinned Muslim thinking. In other words, to be black is to be a slave. The Arabic word abd, a slave of whatever color, went through a semantic development and came to specifically refer to black slave, while light-skinned slaves were referred to as mamluks. And further on in later developments, abd, in spoken Arabic, has come to mean black man of whatever status. This semantic evolution of the word abd from a purely social to racial designation derives from the popular image of the black person in Arab history and society as a slave. Consequently, black Muslims, having cast away the yoke of unbelief that subjected their forefathers to the servile condition, still had to battle and dislodge the notion that the color of their skin was fettered to the condition of servitude. Responding to a contemporary controversy as to whether people from the Western Sudan could ever claim to be legally free on account of their profession of Islam, Ahmad Baba, a black African Muslim, in his Miraj, insisted that the cause of slavery is the content of one's belief and not the color of one's skin. Baba intimated, the Sudanese non-believers are like the other kafir, whether they are Christians, Jews, Persians, Berbers, or any others who stick to non-belief and not embrace Islam. There is no difference between all the kafir in this respect. Whoever is captured in a condition of non-belief, it is legal to own him, whoever he may be, but not he who was converted to Islam voluntarily from the beginning. Ahmad Baba went on to cite other renowned ulama to support his view that slavery in Islam is premised along creedal rather than racial lines. Baba refuted the arguments from the myth of Ham on the basis that the saying of Noah is in the Torah, and in it there is no mention of black color. It only mentions that his, or Ham's, children would be slaves to the children of his brothers, and nothing else. Nevertheless, having placed black Africans under a mythological curse, light-skinned Muslims justified, or rather took leave of, any moral inhibitions in the enslavement of black people. The rebuttals from black Muslim scholars, such as Ahmad Baba, did little to redress the trend. Blacks continue to be enslaved more on the basis of the color of their skin, and, as we now proceed to demonstrate, have since been subjected to stereotypical racial prejudice and discrimination from Arab and other light-skinned Muslim groups. The image of blacks in light-skinned Muslim sources and societies. In pre-Islamic Arab poetry and historical narrative, blacks, who at this stage were by and large Ethiopians, were usually referred to as Habash, the Arabic name from which the term Abyssinian is derived. There is hardly any trace of antagonism or discrimination on the basis of the skin color in pre-Islamic and early Islamic Arabia. In line with this pre-Islamic and early Islamic period, the Quran, apart from one instance where the colors black and white are used in an idiomatic sense to depict evil and good respectively, expresses no prejudice in matters of race or color. Indeed, the Quran makes no specific reference to blacks, Africa, or Abyssinia. In social life in pre-Islamic and early Islamic Arabia, there were black slaves as well as white slaves, mainly captured during war, and there is no evidence that the former suffered any specific discrimination by virtue of the color of their skin. On the contrary, the Habash, who were active in 6th century Arabia as allies of the Byzantines, were usually regarded as people with a higher civilization than the Arabs, and respected during early Islamic times as people with a revealed religion. It was partly due to the high esteem with which the Habash were held in the early Islamic period that Muhammad advised his persecuted followers to seek asylum in Abyssinia in 615 CE. The second caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab, the conqueror of Palestine and Egypt, Amir ibn al-As, and several other companions of Muhammad are known to have had black African traits in their ancestral lines. However, after the death of Muhammad and the early Muslim conquests, there developed what Bernard Lewis describes as an inherent and continuing contradiction between Islamic doctrine on the one hand and the social reality on the other, in the attitude of Arab and subsequently other light-skinned Muslim societies towards blacks. The Hadiths generally insist on the equality of all men in Islam before God. There are, however, a considerable number of Hadiths, even though technically termed weak, in that doubts have been cast over the authenticity as reflecting Muhammad's or his early companions' views, that nevertheless constitute important evidence for contemporary Muslim attitudes. A number of these hadiths deal with race and color, with some specifically condemning other races, especially the black race. One such hadith reports Muhammad as having said of the Ethiopian, "When he is hungry, he steals. When he is sated, he fornicates." Sometimes some of these hadiths have an eschatological dimension, as for instance when Muhammad is quoted as having predicted that the Kaaba would one day be destroyed by black-skinned, short-shanked men who will tear it apart and begin the destruction of the world. Referring to this hadith, the head of the Ahmadiyya Muslim mission in Ghana, Maulvi Wahab Adam, identifies the black-skinned, short-shanked men as Africans of Abyssinian origin and writes, "The Kaaba symbolizes the unity of Allah. It is the symbol of Islam. It stands for Muslim solidarity. It represents all that is dear to all true Muslims. Attempting to destroy the Kaaba would, therefore, mean attempting to destroy the very basis of Islam. It is only an enemy of Islam who would attempt to perpetrate such an ungodly act." There is a possible historical antecedent for the above tradition. The Abyssinians were known, and indeed dreaded, as allies of the powerful Byzantine Empire in its struggle with Persia for influence in the Arabian Peninsula. Abyssinia is known to have conquered Yemen and South Arabia in 525 CE, and in about 570 CE, an Abyssinian viceroy, Abraha, led an expedition against Mecca to capture the city and destroy the Kaaba, ostensibly because of its commercial importance. Even though the expedition was unsuccessful and Abraha's army was destroyed, apparently by plague, the impact of the attempted destruction of the Kaaba on the Meccan psyche must have been profound, to the extent that the incident is linked in traditional Muslim sources with Muhammad's birth. It is against this background that the depiction of blacks as enemies of Islam in the above tradition is, perhaps, best understood. Some other accepted hadith, in their very insistence on the equality between whites and blacks, depict the two as occupying the extreme ends of the best and worst continuum respectively. One such Sahih hadith, attributed to the Prophet of Islam, states, "Obey whoever is put in authority over you, even if he be a crop-nosed Ethiopian slave." Even though this is meant as proof of the egalitarian spirit of Islam, the "even if" and the combination of qualities are a clear indication of ultimate improbability in physical, social, and racial terms. There are other hadith aimed at counteracting those that sought to foster Arab and white supremacy by insisting that true merit is found in piety and good deeds, which takes precedence over genealogy and color. But as rightly pointed out by Bernard Lewis, these hadith, manufactured like those they opposed, clearly reflect the great struggles in the early Islamic empire between the pure Arab conquistador aristocracy, claiming both ethnic and social superiority, and the converts among the conquered, who could claim neither ethnic nor family advantage. In what is apparently an authentic hadith, cited by Fadel Abdallah in support of their interracial utopia of Islam, an Ethiopian woman is said to have come to Muhammad and said, "You Arabs excel us blacks in all, in build, color, and in the possession of the Prophet. If I believe, will I be with you in paradise?" Muhammad replied, "Yes, and in paradise the whiteness of the Ethiopian will be seen over a stretch of 1,000 years. Abdallah then goes on to pose a rhetorical question. Does not this suggest that the issue of color is a question that is relative to our life in this world, and that it is not going to exist in the hereafter? The answer to Abdallah's question is, of course, no. First of all, the very fact that the woman raised the issue of color in her question to Muhammad is proof that color was an issue, indeed, an important issue at that time. Second, the fact that Muhammad, in his alleged attempt to console the disillusioned woman, talks about the whiteness of the Ethiopian, whether taken metaphorically or literally, in paradise apparently as a reward for deserving blacks, can be seen as not only implicitly confirming the superiority of white over black, but as giving the issue an eschatological dimension. If anything at all, the alleged consolation implies that the color black would not be entertained in paradise because it is abhorrent, and so would have to be replaced, albeit as a reward, with the color white. Blacks and people of black ancestry began to suffer various disabilities on account of the color of their skin and racial origin in early Muslim Arab society. Black Muslims who managed to escape the condition of servility through manumission still had a much bigger hurdle to clear in the form of persistent racial prejudice from the wider society. Celebrated black or partly black Muslim poets of early Islamic times, such as Antara, the son of an Arab father and an Abyssinian concubine, Suhaim, or Little Blackie, died 660. Nusayb died between 726 and 731. Abu Dulama, or Father of Blackness, died 776. Sa'id ibn Misjah died between 705 and 715, etc. Both in their nicknames and works indicate that African blood and dark skin were marks of social inferiority and cause for insults, abuse, and discrimination. A verse attributed to Antara runs, "I am a man, of whom one half ranks with the best of abs. The other half I defend with my sword." In another verse, he is even more blunt. "Enemies revile me for the blackness of my skin, but the whiteness of my character effaces the blackness." As early as 671 CE, Ubaydallah, the son of Abu Bakr, a freed Abyssinian slave of the Prophet, was appointed governor of Sistan. But already, blackness had become a reproach, and a satire against him reads as follows: "The blacks do not earn their pay by good deeds, and are not of good repute. The children of a stinking Nubian black, God put no light in their complexions." An anecdote relating to the black poet Dawood ibn Salm, died 750, says that he was arrested along with an Arab called Zayd ibn Jafar for flaunting the use of luxurious clothes. The chronicler notes that the Arab was released while Dawood was flogged. The judge is reported to have said, "I can stand this from Ibn Jafar, but why should I stand it from you? Because of your base origin or your ugly face. Flog him, boy." A similar anecdote preserved by early chroniclers relates to the black musician Sa'id ibn Misjah. It is reported that Ibn Misjah found himself in the company of young men in Damascus, some of whom accepted him while others were reluctant to be in his company. The party was served with food, and Ibn Mishja withdrew, saying, "I am a black man. Some of you may find me offensive. I shall therefore sit and eat apart." The party, relates the chronicler, were embarrassed, but nevertheless arranged for Ibn Mishja to dine separately. There are other anecdotes that speak of good and pious deeds by blacks, albeit in the usual fashion, that simple piety is better than sophisticated wickedness, with the black used as an example of simplicity and piety. Blacks generally are unfavorably depicted in medieval Islamic literature and arts as savages, in adventure literature, demonized in fairy tales, or commonly referred to as lazy, stupid, evil-smelling, and lecherous slaves. Writing on the image of blacks in Turkish folklore, P.N. Boratav points out that the Negro is nothing more or less than the symbol of wickedness and barbarism. Similarly, studies on the image of blacks in medieval Iranian writings reveal that in both Arab and Persian Muslim writings, blacks are depicted as stupid, untruthful, vicious, sexually unbridled, ugly and distorted, excessively merry, and easily affected by music and drink. Some Persian romances add to these stereotypes the images of blacks as cannibals, infidels, enemies of God and Islam, who attack and attempt to occupy Muslim lands. Jihad is portrayed as the only response to the infidel Zanj, the Persian equivalent of Negro, whom God himself once destroyed. The killing of a single black is penance for a lifetime of sin. Great Arab Muslim geographers such as Ibn Hawqal of the 10th century simply did not see the need to waste ink and paper recording anything about blacks. He wrote, "I have not described the country of the African blacks and other peoples of the torrid zone, because naturally loving wisdom, ingenuity, religion, justice, and regular government, how could I notice such people as these, or magnify them by inserting an account of their countries?" Other renowned medieval Muslim thinkers, such as the Spanish Sayyid al-Andalusi, 1029 to 1070, wrote that blacks are more like animals than men, and that the rule of virtue and stability of judgment is lacking among them, with foolishness and ignorance general among them. Blacks, according to al-Andalusi, have never made use of their minds in seeking after wisdom, nor exercised themselves in the study of philosophy. Others, such as Ibn Sina, 980 to 1037, similarly depict blacks as inherently inferior and destined to be enslaved by the rest of mankind. To Ibn Sina, blacks are people who are by their very nature slaves. As far as Nazir al-Din Tusi, 1201 to 1274, a famous Iranian philosopher, was concerned, if various kinds of men are taken, and one placed after another, like the Negro from Zanzibar in the southmost countries, the Negro does not differ from an animal in anything except the fact that his hands have been lifted from the earth, except for what God wishes. Many have seen that the ape is more capable of being trained than the Negro, and more intelligent. Ibn Khaldun, 1332 to 1406, on his part, wrote that blacks are only humans who are closer to dumb animals than to rational beings. The reason for their characteristic levity, excitability, and great emotionalism, according to Ibn Khaldun, is due to the expansion and diffusion of the animal spirit in them. They are therefore remote from those of human beings and close to those of wild animals. Blacks are ignorant of all religion and cannot be considered human beings. Therefore, the Negro nations are, as a rule, submissive to slavery because Negroes have little that is essentially human. Ibn Khaldun disagrees with the mythological curse of Ham and its related effect on blacks, and accepts other contemporary notions that the hot climatic conditions of tropical Africa are what accounts for the color and debased characteristics of black people. Ibn Battuta, died 1368, the great Arab traveler and contemporary of Ibn Khaldun, visited sub-Saharan Africa, ancient Mali, and was astonished to find that blacks, whom he had known only as slaves, were masters and rulers in their own country. Throughout his accounts, the traditional prejudices about blacks are evident. His first impression in meeting the Sultan, who, according to local custom, spoke to him through an interpreter, made Ibn Battuta, who was apparently expecting special treatment as a white guest, regret of having come to their country because of their lack of manners. The food that was served convinced Ibn Battuta that there was no good to be hoped from these people. The traditional welcome meal sent to Ibn Battuta by the Sultan evoked the following comment from the Arab traveller. I got up, thinking that it would be robes of honor and money, but behold, it was 3 loaves of bread and a piece of beef, fried in gati or shea butter, and a gourd containing yogurt. When I saw it, I laughed, and was long astonished at their feeble intellect and their respect for mean things. In the light of all this, it is clear that E.W. Blyden was again ill-informed, to say the least, when he asserted, "It must be evident that Negroes trained under the influence of a Muslim social and literary atmosphere must have a deeper self-respect and higher views of the dignity of human nature than those trained under the blighting influence of caste and under the guidance of a Western Christian literature in which it has been the fashion for more than 200 years to caricature the African, to ridicule his personal peculiarities, and to impress him with a sense of perpetual and hopeless inferiority." An 18th century African Muslim scholar visiting Mecca, apparently on Hajj, had this complaint about Meccan attitudes. "In general, the people of this land love no one, least of all those of our Sudanic race, unless it be for the satisfaction of some need of theirs, without any true affection or friendship." 20th century Asian immigrants in East Africa, who are largely Muslim, are said to have had an immutable belief in their supremacy over the African, whom they exploited mainly as domestic servants. Light-skinned Muslim prejudices against blacks are reflected most in the institution of marriage. The classical Muslim teaching on marriage is that a Muslim male is allowed to marry a non-Muslim female of whatever religion. However, a non-Muslim male is not allowed under any circumstances to marry a Muslim female. Light-skinned Muslim males are permitted to have black females mainly as concubines and also as wives, but no black male is allowed to have relations with light-skinned Muslim females. According to a tradition, Muhammad is alleged to have said, "Be careful in choosing your mates for your offspring, and beware of marrying the Zanji, for he is a distorted creature." Another quotes him as having said, "Do not bring black into your pedigree." Muslim jurists, under the legal doctrine of kafar, loosely translated as equality of birth and social status in marriage, considered marriage between black males and Arab females a misalliance, which some jurists saw as grounds for divorce. Suhaim, a black poet of early Islamic times, in one poem laments thus, "If my color were pink, women would love me, but the Lord has marred me with blackness." In this regard, J.O. Hunwick, writing on the black diaspora in the Islamic world, notes, "In one thing above all others, the stigma of racial origin was apparent: marriage. Whereas, for example, the Karamanli sultans of Tripoli married off their daughters to European slaves to avoid dynastic rivalries, it would have been unthinkable for an Arab or a Berber, a Turk or a Persian, and one would add, Asian, to consent to his daughter marrying a black African, slave or free. Marriage is the other way round, between a black girl and an Arab man, could and did take place, though due to the social obligation of at least offering marriage to a paternal cousin, few black girls can have been the first or sole wife." Medieval Persian collections of tales and fancy stories speak of white females being defiled and contaminated by the touch of black males, with some intimating that only a whore prefers blacks. The good woman will welcome death rather than be touched by a black man. A medieval Muslim thinker, Al-Jahiz, died 869, said to be of partly African descent, decrying this particular attitude, reports a black man castigating Arab Muslims thus: "It is an indication of your ignorance that you thought us fit to marry your women in the days of Jahiliyyah. But when the justice of the egalitarian system of Islam was established, you thought this reprehensible, even though we did not avoid you. The desert, on the other hand, is full of our brethren who intermarried with you, became your chiefs and lords, protected your honor, and sheltered you from your enemy. You made proverbs about us and magnified our kings, in many instances preferring them to your own. This you would not have done if you had not thought us superior to you in this respect. Two important points stand out in the above passage. First of all, it confirms the fact that in pre-Islamic Arabia, blacks were held in high esteem and did marry Arab women, and that the discrimination against the former, on account of the color of their skin, is a development within the Islamic period. Second, it is one of the earliest confirmations that black Muslim men were debarred from marrying light-skinned, especially Arab Muslim women. This situation remains largely unchanged in contemporary Middle Eastern countries, where small black communities live in ghettos and continue to marry among themselves. In our own times, while examples of black men married to white blonde Europeans and Americans are a common phenomenon, with its own controversies and ramifications, such examples remain rare, if any, with Arab, Turkish, Iranian or Asian women. East African Asians, for instance, came to view the practice of their male folk taking African concubines as a social and religious anathema. Offspring from such alliances were disparagingly referred to as chotara. Hence, J.T. Arnold's claim that the Arabs and all other white Muslims, whether brunettes or blondes, have always been free from color prejudice vis-à-vis the non-white races. Under this searching test, the white Muslims have demonstrated their freedom from race feeling by the most convincing of all proofs. They have given their daughters to black Muslims in marriage, and which Fadel Abdallah cites enthusiastically as proof of egalitarian spirit of Islam, is preposterous both in theory and in practice. As alluded to above, a number of notable Muslim poets and writers, mainly of black ancestry, tried in their own ways to counteract Arab Muslim chauvinism in particular, and light-skinned Muslim racial prejudice in general towards blacks. One such early poet is Suhaim, who defended the color of his skin as follows: "My blackness does not harm my habit, for I am like musk. Whoever tastes it does not forget. I am covered with a black garment, but under it there is a lustrous garment with white tails." Nearly a century later, another black poet, Nusayb, died 726, wrote, "Blackness does not diminish me, as long as I have this tongue and this stout heart. Some are raised up by means of their lineage. The verses of my poems are my lineage. How much better a keen-minded, clear-spoken black man than a mute white." Also, Al-Jahiz, mentioned above, wrote, "The boasts of the blacks over the whites," citing a poem purportedly composed by a black in response to light-skinned Muslim racism in the following words: "Although my hair is curly and my skin black as coal, I am open-handed and my honor is untarnished. My black color is surely no cause for shame, for on the day of fearful battle, I haughtily brandish my sword." Al-Jahiz went on to outline some of the virtues of blacks, such as their honesty, valor, generosity, piety, oratory, etc. And the fact, or rather myth, that it was a black monarch, the Negus of Abyssinia, who was the first ruler to convert to Islam. Meanwhile, elsewhere in his writings, Al-Jahiz described the Zanj as the least intelligent and the least discerning of mankind, and said that the Zanj are the worst of men and most vicious of creatures in character and temperament. Al-Jahiz no doubt admired Arab Muslim culture and sought to identify himself with it. There is also no doubt that Al-Jahiz's defense of blacks against racial prejudice was in some definite ways satirical and therefore has to be treated with caution. Nevertheless, Al-Jahiz on the whole was serious in his defense of blacks in the above-mentioned work. His ambivalence, though, is an indication of a man faced with a serious identity crisis. It is a wry commentary on what it was like to be educated and famous, and yet part African, in the medieval Muslim world. It has been observed in this connection that Al-Jahiz was a 9th century equivalent of those New World Creoles and mulattoes, and, one would add, present-day Swahilis of East Africa, and other mixed Arab, Moor, or Berber African offspring from North Africa, of 1,000 years later, who rejected the African part of their heritage, in order the more enthusiastically to praise the Christian and Muslim and civilized values of those who had enslaved their ancestors but who were, at the same time, themselves not fully accepted into those cultures. Because of their low image, some blacks sought Arab pedigree to enhance their social standing. It took a ruling of Caliph al-Mahdi, 775 to 85, to abrogate all such naturalizations, apparently in a bid to preserve the Arab status quo, by ensuring that the color black did not get into the Arab pedigree. Other later medieval Muslim writers such as Jamal al-Din Abu al-Faraj ibn al-Jazwi, died 1208, and the celebrated Egyptian jurist Jalal al-Din al-Suyuti, died 1505, wrote works mainly in defense of Abyssinians. It should be emphasized, though, that light-skinned Muslim racial prejudice was not necessarily due to their religious Islamic persuasion. On the contrary, in addition to what we have observed above on the Quranic position and that of pre-Islamic and early Islamic periods, the Quran speaks of mankind as created from a single source, a single soul, and a single parentage, and regards the various differences in languages, color, and race as signs of God's wonder and magnificence that has to be celebrated. Having said that, the above evidence shows that racial prejudice against blacks, pious Muslim teaching notwithstanding, if not a purely Muslim creation, surely owes its earliest and clearest ideological expression to Muslim sources. Akbar Muhammad accepts that there is racial prejudice in Muslim societies against blacks, but suggests that Muslims echo the external traditions of the Jews, Greeks, and perhaps others. Of course, to rule out completely possible influences and cultural exchanges at that or any other time in human encounter simply smacks of infantile naivety. And in this regard, it would be interesting to investigate the extent to which racial prejudice in Western Europe against blacks could have Muslim influences, since the former owes much of its medieval literary and philosophical traditions to the latter. Having said that, there is hardly any evidence to support possible Jewish and Greek influences on Muslim attitudes towards blacks. Indeed, studies on ancient Greek, Roman, and rabbinical Jewish views on slavery and race contain almost no suggestion of the equation of color to servitude or anti-black consciousness. Be that as it may, that these attitudes are widely reflected in the writing of eminent and pious Muslim thinkers down the ages shows how serious the gap between teaching and practice has been in the so-called great and revealed religions of the world. The underlying reasons for the light-skinned Muslim attitude towards blacks could be historical, such as the menace of Abyssinia to Arabia, the fact that Muslims down the ages encountered Africans mainly as slaves, or sociological factors, as is in the case of Asian attitudes towards Africans in East and Southern Africa. Whatever the case may be, it seems that by placing blacks under a mythological curse, stereotyping and stigmatizing them on account of the content of their belief and color of their skin, Muslims of all races waged war against and raided Africans, killing millions and reducing millions of others to slavery over the last 14 centuries. This we shall now proceed to examine. Muslim slavery and the slave trade. The Arab Oriental dimension. As mentioned above, hard evidence for black slaves outside tropical Africa dates back to about 200 BCE in North Africa, and especially Egypt. Similarly, the earliest documentary information about Arab traffic in black slaves from East Africa, as pointed out in the first part of this chapter, dates back to around the early 2nd century CE. The mode of acquisition was most probably through Arab pirating, even though one cannot for certain completely rule out purchase from local agents. It is also well attested that slavery existed in pre-Islamic Arabia and, indeed, in the Mediterranean region. In these areas too, there is evidence of black slaves, along with slaves from other races, who were mainly war captives. notwithstanding the various possible meanings of the term Habash, a generally accepted term for Abyssinians in particular, and blacks in general at the time. There is no disagreement over the presence of numerous black slaves in pre- and early Islamic Arabia. In fact, some scholars have argued that the power of Mecca at the time was founded on an army of black slaves. The Prophet of Islam and his companions are known to have owned slaves through capture in war and purchase, and also to have set large numbers of them free. Abd al-Rahman ibn Auf, one of the 10 closest companions of the Prophet of Islam, is said to have freed on his death in 652 no less than 30,000 slaves. Many of the companions themselves are known to have had slave origins. The most well-known of these was, of course, Bilal ibn Rabah, an Abyssinian slave who converted to Islam, was purchased and freed by Muhammad, and became his personal attendant and the first muadhin, one who recites the Muslim call to prayer in Islam. Slavery in general, and black enslavement in particular, thus developed into deeply entrenched institutions, accepted in the mainline Muslim heritage by learned Muslim lawyers and pious believers as a matter of course. Right from the conquest of Egypt by Arab armies in between 639 and 642 CE, the land of the blacks, Bilad al-Sudan, became a reservoir of slaves for the Muslim world. The main sources of slaves were war, jihad, raid, tribute, purchase, and kidnapping. As part of the Baqt signed between Nubia and Muslim rulers of Egypt in the 7th century, 360 slaves were sent annually as tribute to their emir in Egypt, and this remained in force for over 7 centuries. Muslim Arabs were the chief agents of the traffic of black Africans as slaves from East and Central Africa into the Islamic heartlands, virtually right from the 7th century. The coast of the Zanj, i.e., the coastlands of modern Kenya and Tanzania, was opened by Arabs from the Persian Gulf area, from where slaves were exported to Basra and thence to Baghdad and other centers of Iraq, the sugar plantations of Khuzestan, to Bandar Abbas in southern Persia, and to Al-Asa, the Arabian Peninsula. Somalis, prior to their Islamization, and later interior peoples such as the Gala, were exported as slaves from the Somali coast across into Yemen, and from there, via Mecca, to Damascus and Baghdad. From Abyssinia, Gala, Quraysh, Hararis, and other tribes were exported to Arabia and up the Red Sea to Egypt. In Iraq, a large number of East African slaves, the Zanj, were employed in their thousands on the sugar plantations of Khuzestan and saltpeter mines of the Abbasid Caliphate, located on the Euphrates, as early as the 8th century. Apparently due to the harsh conditions to which they were subjected, they rose in numerous revolts, and between 868 and 883, their rebellion became a real threat to the Abbasid Caliphate. The hunting, kidnapping, purchase and traffic of Africans into servitude went on throughout the centuries, but increased greatly in the 19th century after Said ibn Sultan, ruler of Muscat, in 1832, moved to Zanzibar and established plantation farming. Here, Arab and Swahili Muslim slave traders took advantage of prevailing internecine conflicts and cashed in on the captives of war, with stronger African tribes such as the Yao, Nyamwezi, and Ganda acting as crucial intermediaries and accomplices. Men like Tipu Tib and Rumaliza organized well-armed gangs of slave raiders in the interior with the sole aim of raiding smaller indigenous communities whom they could then march, both as commodities themselves and as porters of ivory, to the coast for sale. A.J. Swan describes one of Tipu Tib's slave caravans that he encountered during the last quarter of the 19th century. As they filed past, we noticed many chained together by the neck. The women, who are as numerous as the men, carried babies on their backs in addition to the tusk of ivory or other burden on their heads. It is difficult to adequately describe the filthy state of their bodies, in many instances not only scarred by the cut of the chicote, a piece of hide used to enforce obedience, but feet and shoulders were a mass of open sores. Half-starved, ill-treated creatures who, weary and friendless, must have longed for death. In conversation, one of the headmen admitted that most of the slaves died during the journey of hunger and exhaustion. When asked what happens if any of the slaves became too ill or weak to continue the journey, the headman replied, "Spear them at once, for, if we did not, others would pretend they are ill in order to avoid carrying their loads. No, we never leave them alive on the road. They all know this custom." In response to another question as to who carries the ivory when a mother, carrying a baby and ivory, gets too tired to carry both, the headman replied, "She does. We cannot leave valuable ivory on the road. We spear the child and make her burden lighter. Ivory first, child afterwards." The route from the interior of Africa through Lake Tanganyika to the coast was littered with skeletons as a result of slaves dying from exhaustion, hunger, or the brutality of their couriers, sometimes still yoked together. Deaths during the journeys were so numerous that it has been estimated that for every slave who reached the coast in Zanzibar, 4 or 5 lives were lost in transit. An Arab slave dealer by name Sayeb bin Habib is reported in 1882 to have admitted that out of 300 slaves he acquired from the interior, only 50 reached the coast alive. David Livingstone observed that if the slaughter committed during the raids is taken into account, in addition to the deaths along the routes, then the price of every single slave who arrived at Zanzibar would be about 10 lives. Bustling slave markets emerged in Zanzibar and along the East African coast, with eyewitness reports of young men, women and children being arrayed, inspected and sold like animals until the intervention of European colonial anti-slavery policies. Bagamoyo, in present-day Tanzania, was one such slave market. The name of the town, which means "vomit out your heart," tells the horrors of the East African slave trade. So chilling was the experience that European eyewitnesses doubted if their skeptical country people back home would ever believe their accounts. In this regard, David Livingstone deemed it extremely necessary, in his description of the horrors of the slave trade in East Africa, to keep far within the truth in order not to be thought guilty of exaggeration. But, he added, in sober seriousness, the subject does not admit of exaggeration. To overdraw its evils is simple impossibility. The main areas from which slaves were drawn and exported to Egypt and other North African Muslim locations, and then to the wider Islamic world, were the Central and Western Sudan. The traffic started mainly from Nubia, from where people living to the south and east of Dongola, such as the Beja, and then tribes of the Nuba Mountains much later around the 14th century were taken to Egypt. Slaves were also exported from the Kanem Borno via Fezzan to Cairo, Tripoli, and Kairouan. People groups living around the Lake Chad area were later exported along this route, while in the 18th and 19th centuries, Bagirimi slaves, especially eunuchs, formed an important part of the slave traffic along this route. Some were sent later from Tripoli to ports in modern Turkey, Greece, Albania, and southern Yugoslavia, which were all at the time under the Ottoman Empire. Slaves from the Middle Niger and the Atlantic coast were also drawn from Gao via Ouargla to Tahert in modern Algeria, and Kairouan, and later from Timbuktu through Tuat to Tlemcen, Sijil Massa, Fez, and other centers of the Western Maghreb, from where some passed into Muslim Spain and Sicily when it was under Muslim domination between the 9th and 11th centuries. Ibn Khaldun testifies to the presence of a large black slave population in 14th century North Africa, when he wrote that blacks constituted the ordinary mass of slaves. Muslim Berber groups of North Africa, like the Tuareg and Moors, became the chief agents in the raiding and in the traffic of black slaves to North Africa, Spain, Turkey, and the Mediterranean world, some of whom were taken as far as India. As early as the 8th century, the Berber Ibadi community of North Africa virtually controlled the trade routes and thus the traffic in black slaves. Indiscriminate Arab-Muslim slave raiding in the Bilad al-Sudan reached alarming proportions in the 14th century, resulting in a letter from the ruler of Bornu to the Sultan of Egypt complaining about the slave raiding attitude of some Muslim Arabs. In the words of the ruler, "These Arabs have devastated all our country, the whole of Al-Banu, up to this day. They have seized our free men and our relatives, who are Muslims, and sold them to the slave dealers of Egypt and Syria, and others. Some they have kept for their own service. Restrain the Arabs from their debauchery." The Sudan remained the main reservoir of slaves for Egypt well into the later part of the 19th and early part of the 20th centuries. By the 19th century, the slave trade had become a well-regulated government activity in Egypt, and under the command of one Ali Khurshid Aga and one Zubair, many Sudanese tribes were raided and ravaged. Muhammad Ali spurred his troops on in this regard in a special dispatch in 1823. "You are aware that the end of all our effort and this expense is to procure Negroes. Please show zeal in carrying out our wishes in this capital matter." Between 1892 and 1900, one Rabi ibn Abdallah, a ruthless slave trader, operated in the Chad region from Manifa and later from Dikwa. He literally devastated indigenous African communities in the region until he was killed in battle with the French in 1900 around the area of West Lake Chad. The trans-Saharan slave trade, like its East African counterpart, increased in volume during the 18th and 19th centuries. The Ottoman rulers entered into a trading pact with the Muslim Bornu, and large numbers of Bagrimi slaves were transported across the Sahara to the slave markets of Tripoli. From Kano, in modern northern Nigeria, slaves captured from non-Muslim tribes living to the south of the Hausa towns, such as the Gwari and Katab, from the other parts of northern Nigeria were acquired, most probably from around the 16th century, and taken along the 40-day route to Dongola and Egypt, and also via Boku and Tibesti through Kufra to Cyrenaica. The jihad movements of the 18th and 19th centuries in the Western Sudan degenerated into well-organized Muslim raids on pagan communities for slaves, meant for local use and also to supply the trans-Saharan trade route. Many eyewitness accounts talk in very sobering terms of the loss of life along the route. One such account, given by an eyewitness in 1822, talks about a well near Bir Moshuru, where the ground around is strewed with human skeletons, the slaves, who have arrived exhausted with thirst and fatigue. At one spot, there were more than 100 skeletons. Gustav Nachtigall talked about littered skeletons and, half buried in the sand, the mummified corpses of some children, still covered with the blue cotton rags, at the same well. At other wells referred to as the wells of El Hamar, the skeletons were countless. The route itself was equally littered with skeletons accumulated at the rate of 80 and 90 a day. According to one Major Denham, the Arabs laughed heartily at my expression of horror and said they are only blacks, Nambu, damn their fathers, and began knocking their limbs about with the butt end of their firelock, saying, "This was a woman, this was a youngster." The methods of killing exhausted or sick slaves and those who attempted to escape in East Africa were also used on the trans-Saharan route. Nachtigall accompanied a caravan of hundreds of slaves from Bagrimi to the slave markets of Kuka and witnessed exhausted and sick slaves being slaughtered and their arteries cut open. After such horrid experiences, Nachtigall pointed out that, in estimating the weight of the burden placed by the slave trade on its pagan victims, it had to be borne in mind that for every one who arrived at Kuka, there were probably 3 to 4 who died or disappeared on the way. A French observer estimated that the price for one slave sold in the slave markets of North Africa might represent the loss of 10 others who were killed in the raids or died in transit. Apart from this significantly high loss of life during the raids and the journey into servitude, conservative estimates suggest that between 11 and 14 million Africans were transported into Muslim lands outside tropical Africa over the past 14 centuries. A highly reputable 19th century Moroccan historian described the traffic and sale of blacks in North Africa markets as the heinousness of the affliction which has beset the lands of the Maghreb since ancient times in regard to the indiscriminate enslaving of the people of the Sudan, and the importation of droves of them every year to be sold in the marketplaces in town and country, where men trade in them as one would trade in beasts, nay, worse than that. People have become so inured to that, generation after generation, that many common folk believe that the reason for being enslaved, according to the holy law, is merely that a man should be black in color and come from those regions. The holiest city of Islam, Mecca, became the center of the slave trade in the world and remained so well into the 20th century. From there, slaves captured and brought from East Africa and the Sudan were distributed to all parts of Arabia and the Muslim world. It became a custom for pilgrims to take slaves for sale in Mecca, or buy 1 or 2 slaves while on Hajj as souvenirs to be kept, sold, or given as gifts. High-ranking Muslims who performed the pilgrimage are known to have always taken along large contingents of slaves as porters and guards, and to tend their master's needs. One of those needs was, as one writer puts it, cash. Owners often used slaves as a kind of traveler's check. Mansa Musa of Mali, during pilgrimage in 1324 CE, took along a vast number of dignitaries and slaves to serve the same purposes. Slaves became a permanent feature of pilgrimage arrangements. Many unsuspecting free people were taken on pilgrimage, sold or arrested on trumped-up charges, and ultimately ended up as slaves. European colonial powers, such as Holland, France, and England, in a bid to protect their subjects who undertook the Hajj, enacted laws making the head of a family or group of pilgrims accountable for each of its members. The buying and selling of slaves went on in the slave markets of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Oman, most especially in Mecca, well into the 20th century. As late as 1960, some Tuareg notables were reported to have sold slaves in Arabia to defray part of the expense of their pilgrimage. Muslim slavery and the slave trade. The African dimension. Black African Muslim involvement in enslaving traditional African believers is well known within the sub-Saharan African context. Here, the ideological and religious justification of enslavement was primarily kufr, non-belief in Islam. The same procedures of jihad, organized annual and sporadic raids, tribute, kidnapping, and purchase were followed in acquiring slaves. In most cases, these were carried out in the cruelest and most brutal forms possible. The ruling dynasties of Islamic-inspired kingdoms that arose mainly in the western and central parts of Africa between the 13th and 16th centuries, such as the Songhay and Mali, raided, enslaved, and exported large numbers of members of neighboring tribes. Reference has already been made to Mansa Musa, the most celebrated ruler of Mali, and his ostentatious pilgrimage to Mecca, during which he carried along a large contingent of slaves for sale. The famous Arab geographer Ibn Battuta, mentioned above, during his visit to Mali in the 14th century, observed that the inhabitants of Takeda and Walata live in luxury and ease and vie with one another in regard to the number of slaves and serving women. The Musi became the main target of Songhai slave raids under the Askias in the 15th century. In 1498, Askia Mohammed I declared a jihad against the Musi that resulted in so many slaves that a special quarter had to be built for them. Some of the royals of the Askia ruling dynasties even boasted of capturing up to 10,000 slaves in one raid. Most of these slaves were meant for local use by the Askias themselves, described as major consumers of slave labor, while some were either sold to the trans-Saharan slave traders or given out as pious gifts to Muslim divines. The enslavement of traditional Africans became even more intense in the 18th and 19th century jihad periods. While most of the jihad leaders of West Africa condemned the enslavement of fellow Muslims, their activities led to substantial raiding of non-Muslim communities. The jihad initiated by Uthman Dan Fodio in northern Nigeria, for instance, is known to have degenerated into brazen slave raiding expeditions. Those communities that suffered most from Fulani Hausa slave raiding were the tribes in the middle belt of modern-day Nigeria and those of Adamawa region. Early 20th century observers were in no doubt that the slave raid, as a national habit of the Sokoto Caliphate, is still usually directed against natives of a different religion, traditional believers who are assumed to be of a lower order of humanity. The raids directed against mainly peasant traditional communities were always carefully planned and organized, surrounded in a general atmosphere of piety and prayer, seeking the help of Allah for successful raids. The following account of a raid on the Gwari tribe, taken from a novel written by a former Prime Minister of Nigeria, Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, gives interesting insights into the tactics employed by Muslim slave raiders against non-Muslim peasant communities. On their arrival in this place, they all dismounted from their horses and lay down at the foot of some thick shady trees where no one could see them. At this season, the rains had begun to set in, and all the farmers were about to clear their farms. Now there was no way that these pagans could sow a crop sufficient to feed them for a whole year. So they had to come out of their towns and come down to the low ground to lay out their farms in the plain. Despite this, however, they were not able to tend their farms properly for fear of raiders. When the raiders reached the village, they hid on the edge of the farms. Early in the morning, just before the time of prayer, the pagans began to come out from their villages, making for their farms. The raiders crouched silently, watching everything that they were doing. They held back until all the people had come out. Then, after they had settled down to work, thinking that nothing would happen to them, the raiders fell upon them all at once and seized men and women, and even small children. Before the pagans had realized what was happening, the raiders had already done the damage. At once, other pagans began to sally forth, preparing to fight to wrest back their brothers who had been captured. Before they were ready, the raiders were far away. They started to follow them, but they had no chance of catching them. The account concludes, they kept on going until, by God's grace, they reached home safely. As his kit kept emphasizing, this is only a story, but he himself admits that these accounts, nevertheless, reflect true incidents that the author had heard of. And talking about true incidents, Umaru Nagwamaste, 1859 to 76, Emir of Kontagora and grandson of Danfodio, is noted as one of the most notorious slave raiders. It is said that he would normally send raiding parties into outlying hamlets, set the crops on fire, and have the hamlet besieged and systematically starved out of its inhabitants. According to some observers, Umaru's reign was the crudest, cruelest form of imperialism. To satisfy one man's ambition, families were torn asunder and flourishing communities wiped out. It has been estimated that during some 80 years of the reign of Umaru's family, a population of close to 1 million was reduced to hardly 30,000. One of Umaru's sons, Ibrahim, who ascended to the emirship in 1879, kept up the family tradition of slave raiding and was nicknamed the Eater-up of towns. Upon hearing that the British were out for him because of his slave raiding activities, Ibrahim is reported to have retorted, "Can you stop a cat from mousing? When I die, it will be with a slave in my mouth." Slave raids were quite extensive in all the emirates of northern Nigeria, and in Adamawa, in particular, the practice continued until the 1920s. Organized raids sometimes involve the coordinated efforts of several political units referred to in some sources as polyglot raiding confederacies. Adult men were usually killed and the women, children and younger ones carried away. The Sokoto Caliphate, therefore, became the largest slave society in Africa in the 19th century, and one of the largest slave societies in modern history, with Adamawa as the major slave reservoir of the Caliphate. The situation was not dissimilar in Bornu, the domain of Sheikh Mohammed al-Amin al-Kanimi. Even though al-Kanimi opposed the jihad of the Sokoto Caliphate, he shared with them the philosophy that the lot of pagans in Muslim territories was enslavement. To ensure a constant reservoir of slaves to meet the insatiable demand for home and the trans-Saharan market in Bornu, only the great men amongst them must become Muslim by order of the Sheikh, while the poor people are left to do as they please. An eyewitness account of Bornu's slave raiding is given by Heinrich Barth, who accompanied a slave raiding gang against traditional believers of Musku between 1851 and 1852. An army of over 20,000 marched against this well-organized and industrious agricultural community, murdering, burning and destroying crops as they went. The inhabitants fled into the forest. Only women and young people were kept. Full-grown men were massacred. Barth talks of one particular instance. A large number of slaves had been caught this day. Altogether, they were said to have taken 1,000, and they were certainly not less than 500. To our utmost horror, not less than 170 full-grown men were mercilessly slaughtered in cold blood, the greater part of them being allowed to bleed to death, a leg having been severed from the body. Within the Senegambian region, the pattern was no different. Umar al-Hajj Taz Jihad and those of several others in this region brought about a devastating effect on the acephalous traditional communities. Umar himself is said to have owned about 4,000 slaves in 1866. Samori Touré is another well-known jihadist whose slave-raiding activities brought about large-scale devastating effects on both traditional and even Muslim communities in parts of present-day Guinea, Ivory Coast, Ghana, and Burkina Faso. In the name of jihad, Muslim warriors became the principal suppliers of slaves for local use and export via the trans-Saharan and transatlantic routes. The coastal people of the Senegambian region were reduced to vassalage and raided by Muslim overlords for sale as slaves. A brother of the Muslim ruler of Fouta Djallon, in response to an insinuation by a French official that Muslim wars were mainly prompted by the resultant booty of slaves, is reported to have said, "Mahometans were no better than Christians. The one stole, the other held the bag." Muslims were by no means the sole producers of consumers of slaves within the African context. As indicated above, powerful traditional chiefdoms such as Bambara, Dahomey, and Ashanti are known for their involvement as suppliers to the transatlantic slave trade and the use of slave labor in agricultural and mining industries. However, Muslim emirates were by far the major suppliers of slaves. Indeed, the trans-Saharan and transatlantic slave trades reached their peak between the late 17th and early 19th centuries, when the Muslim tradition of military jihad was in ascendancy in the Western Sudan. Most of the jihad movements became the main source of slaves. Muslim merchants, for their part, by virtue of their monopoly over trade at the time, also monopolized the retail part of the human commodity. The Maraka, Dayula, Yase, Hausa, Swahili, Jabati, Beriberi, Yao, the infamous Jalaba of Sudan, joined their Arab, Moorish and Tuareg co-religionists as the principal middlemen in the human traffic. Muslim merchants operated not only in Muslim-controlled areas like the Emirates of West Africa or Zanzibar in East Africa, but also in areas under non-Muslim rule, such as Ashanti and Christian Ethiopia. This, we must intimate again, was only a matter of course because long-distance trade was virtually a Muslim monopoly at the time. Slaves were not just acquired for sale, but were extensively employed by African Muslim states and communities. Slave villages were created around the capitals of Muslim emirates of northern Nigeria and the Senegambian region. These settlements, always forming a ring around Muslim capitals such as Sokoto and Hamdulahi in the Senegambia and numerous others, contained between 50 and 500 slaves. Slave labor became the economic backbone of Muslim states during this period. Muslim religious communities such as the Torankawa of Timbuktu, those of Walata, Jenne, and the Dayula diaspora, and the Jahanke clerical groups, depended on slave labor for agricultural cultivation in order to give them time to pursue their vocation of learning and trading. These groups acquired their slaves mainly through purchase from traders and raiders, as well as through pious gifts and payments for religious services. The Jahanke and other Muslim masters came to measure the prestige or importance of a clerical order by the size of slave quarters existing in it. Commenting on the difference between the attitude of Muslim Maraka and their traditional Bambara cousins in the use of slave labor, R.L. Roberts notes that, despite changes in the economy and society during the 19th century, the Bambara remained peasant cultivators, and masters usually worked side by side with their slaves. In contrast, Maraka society was transformed through a progressive reliance on slave labor. Farming became a degraded occupation. So vital was the factor of slave labor in Muslim areas that when slaves took advantage of colonial anti-slavery policies and escaped en masse from their masters, one French administrator was concerned that the exodus would mean ruin and maybe death by starvation for Maraccas, incapable of cultivating their fields. By the end of the 19th century, surveys conducted in Muslim parts of Africa revealed staggering proportions of slaves or people of slave origins forming part of the populations. In 1894, thanks to the French efforts to assess the situation of slavery in the region, it was revealed that about 30 to 50% of the total population of the Western Sudan were slaves, with up to 80% near some commercial centers. About 3/4 of the population of Senegambia were slaves. By the 1890s, the slave population of the plantation surrounding Banamba, the commercial center of Maracca, outnumbered the free inhabitants by a ratio of 2 to 1. In Touba, the Jahanke clerical center, the slave population of the town of about 3,000 inhabitants numbered between 11 and 12,000. In the district of Segu, Al-Hajj Umar's capital, the population was 53% slave in 1894. The proportion of slave and people of slave origin ranged from 3/4 of the population in the Say district to 50% in the districts of Jogu, Dori, Kays, Kita, Sikasso, and Timbuktu. In Kankan, 57% of the population were slaves, while in Sikasso, the capital of Tieba, 2/3 of the population were found to be slaves in 1904. The same percentage was estimated for the slave population of Bobo Dioulasso. In areas immediately around Kong and Bandama, however, the proportion of slaves approached 80%. In northern Nigeria, the same pattern of slave concentration is revealed. Kano, the largest and most prosperous province of the Sokoto Caliphate, had, as a conservative estimate, slaves forming 50% of the population, and more than 95% in the capital. Within the Yola provincial district, population censuses taken during the colonial period reveal that there were 16,450 free Fulbe and 20,000 slaves. Within the Sokoto Caliphate as a whole, during the 19th and early part of the 20th centuries, slaves are said to have certainly numbered in millions, and perhaps as many as 10 million. On the island of Zanzibar in East Africa, in 1907, there were 27,000 freed slaves, and 140,000 slaves out of an estimated population of 208,700. Muslims, with the rare and refreshing exception of Al-Naziri, a 19th century Moroccan historian, generally viewed the anti-slavery measures of the European colonial powers in the 19th and early 20th centuries both as a threat to their livelihood and as an attack on Islam. Al-Naziri wrote an impassioned treatise attacking the traffic and sale of blacks in the Maghreb, castigating the slave dealers as men with no morals, no manly qualities, and no religion. The thrust of Al-Naziri's argument was that the people of the Sudan are Muslims, or at least majority Muslim, which renders their enslavement illegal in Islam. Referring to what he calls the evil of the times, which makes it impossible to know the truth as to who is legally enslavable and who is not, Al-Naziri declared that anyone who enters into a transaction of this forbidden nature is imperiling his salvation. Describing Muslim enslavement of blacks in particular as one of the foulest and gravest evils perpetrated upon God's religion, and the institution of slavery in general as an evil which is derogatory to honor and religion, Al-Naziri concludes his treatise with a prayer to God to grant success to the efforts of the abolitionists. For the reason in holy law which existed at the time of the Prophet and the pious forefathers for enslaving people does not exist today, that is, being taken prisoner in jihad, which has as its object to make the word of God supreme and to bring men to his religion, which he chose for his servants. The last sentence of the treatise is a plea for God's forgiveness for Muslims because we have wronged ourselves, and if you do not pardon us and have mercy upon us, we shall be among those who suffer eternal loss. Refreshing as Al-Naziri's views are, his position was a rare one as far as Muslim attitudes to slavery are concerned. In response to a letter by the British Consul General of Morocco in 1842, asking the Sultan of that country about the measures, if any, taken to abolish the slave trade, the Sultan replied in astonishment thus, Be it known to you that the traffic in slaves is a matter on which all sects and nations have agreed from the time of the sons of Adam, on whom be the peace of God, up to this day, and we are not aware of its being prohibited by the laws of any sect. And no one need ask this question, the same being manifest to both high and low, and requires no more demonstration than the light of day. With regard to abolition itself, it was not until November 1962 that the government of Saudi Arabia, which was exempted from British abolitionist efforts in the 19th century on religious grounds, found a favourable opportunity formally to abolish slavery on paper. The government is said to have paid £1,785,000 in compensation for the liberation of 1,682 slaves. However, United Nations anti-slavery reports estimated between 100,000 and 250,000 slaves in Saudi Arabia at the time, while the then Prime Minister Faisal is reported to have revealed in an interview with a British journalist that the slave population numbered many thousands. There is therefore little doubt that the official number of slaves freed, as an act of propaganda, was a minuscule part of the real slave population. On this note, Fadel Abdallah's rather fantastic claim that only deviation from Islam prevented elimination of slavery within the first few decades of Islam. In Arabia itself, within 40 years, except for temporary prisoners of war, slavery had disappeared, shows the extent to which his informed intellectual effort is prepared to compromise facts and truth in order to defend Islam. Indeed, on the whole, as far as the Muslim world in general and the Arab world in particular is concerned, no moral opprobrium has clung to slavery. The decision by Arab states to abolish slavery during this century was taken for reasons that had little to do with the moral aspects of the issue. Pressure from the Western powers, the introduction of a money economy, and the realization that maintaining slavery would forever bar Arab nations from entering the councils of international society provide a much better explanation for their announced policy. That slavery and the slave trade were inherently evil and therefore merited abolition were thoughts alien to Arab heads of state and their followers. Within sub-Saharan Africa, the story is not different. The pacifist Jahanke community strongly opposed abolition and was prepared to take up arms in defense of their age-long tradition. Cherno Aliu, known as the Wali of Goomba, was therefore content to allow the repossession of slaves to be invoked at the shibboleth of a populist cause. The Sudanese, it is said, viewed abolition as interference in their way of life and the undermining of one of their major sources of livelihood that was not only unjustified but also opposed to Islam. European anti-slavery measures helped provoke the jihad of Muhammad Ahmad of Sudan, the Sudanese Mahdi, and became the rallying cry of his uprising against the British. The fact that Europeans were the chief executors of the abolition policy reinforced the perception that the policies were repressive and heretical Christian laws. Raiding and trafficking slaves were banned, but the legal status of slavery in Muslim societies and countries was generally recognized and indeed sanctioned by the colonial powers. In Zanzibar, for example, the British, in recognition of Muslim and native customary laws, ruled that the non-Muslims could not legally own slaves, but that a Muslim could, upon appeal to Muslim law. In some instances, slaves who took advantage of colonial anti-slavery pronouncements and deserted their Muslim masters were captured and returned. Lord Lugard, the colonial High Commissioner for Northern Nigeria, visited Sokoto, and hundreds of desperate slaves took advantage of his presence and escaped with him. But in a bizarre fashion, Lugard's response, in his own words, was as follows. I had promised not to interfere with existing domestic slaves. There was nothing to be done but to send these poor wretches back and instruct the resident to inquire into all deserving cases. Doubtless very many bolted to neighboring towns, but I considered my obligations of honor and of necessity were satisfied when I turned them out of my own following, and I did not inquire too curiously what became of them. The overthrow of the ruler of Oman in 1970 revealed some 500 slaves kept by the Sultan in his palace. In Mauritania, slavery was abolished on paper in 1981, but anti-slavery and other human rights organizations claim that, as at 1995, About 300,000 black slave descendants, known as the Haratin, continue to be held in servitude. Their children are occasionally sold or given out as presents and arms. There are also claims by the United Nations Human Rights Commission and other reputable international organizations that chattel slavery persists in the Sudan. It is said that slave raiding has resurfaced in that country since the resumption of the civil war in 1985. Local Arab militia are said to raid and capture Dinka and Nuba young men, women and children, the young ones being sold or kept as personal property. In a report presented by the Secretary General to the United Nations General Assembly in October 1995, the abduction and traffic of young boys and girls from southern Sudan to the northern part of the country for sale as servants or concubines is highlighted in several paragraphs. In Muslim West Africa, slave owners simply subsume slavery from a slave-master relationship to a student-teacher relation within the Quran school systems. It was normal practice that when a student enrolled in a Quran school, he was regarded as a domestic slave of the teacher. The student, for all practical purposes, followed the same work schedule as other slaves, with the slight difference that he received a modicum of education while in residence. Upon completion, parents had to redeem their awards with a slave or the price of one. Failure to do so left such students in the hands of the master, just as any other slave. Recent studies reveal that within the northern Nigerian context, people can still be found who are considered slaves, although the actual number of people still technically so has declined to relative insignificance. The death of slavery, pronounced by so many observers, has been a protracted one and is still not over. The various roles of slaves in Muslim lands. The majority of slaves in Muslim lands were destined to be domestic servants. In areas like North Africa, the Middle East, and Turkey, black slaves did the meanest and hardest work. Female slaves were required as household servants and cooks, and for the more specifically female tasks of wet nurse, childminder, and, for those deemed attractive, concubine. A 19th century Darfur song put it thus: "If we find a girl among them, slaves, who pleases us, then she doesn't need to do any housework. I make her my wife so that we can sleep together in bed and eat the skin so that we will have children. Then she becomes pregnant and has a child. If it is a boy, then everything is fine." Slaves of different ethnic origins acquired reputations for different qualities and tasks. The Zanj and the Sudan women, for instance, were regarded as good wet nurses. They were not generally appreciated as concubines, even though in North Africa in particular, they must have played the role extensively. The Nubian and Abyssinian women were highly esteemed concubines. The 12th century Arab geographer Al-Idrisi wrote rapturously about them. "Of all the black women, they are the best for the pleasures of the bed. It is on account of these qualities of theirs that the rulers of Egypt were so desirous of them and outbid others to purchase them, afterwards fathering children from them." Ibn Butlan wrote a dossier in the 11th century in which he described the different qualities of slaves from various parts of the world. After warning buyers to be careful with the cunning tricks of slave dealers when buying female slaves, he went on to outline the different qualities of slave women from the various parts of the world. Most Abyssinian women, in the words of Ibn Butlan, have gracious, soft, and weak bodies. They are delicate and do not thrive in any country other than that in which they were born. They are good, obliging, tractable, and trustworthy, and distinguished by strength of body despite their slenderness, and also by weakness of character and shortness of life because of their bad digestion. Similarly, the Nubian women, of all the black races, have ease and grace and delicacy. Their bodies are dry, while their flesh is tender. The climate of Egypt suits them, since they drink the water of the Nile. Their characters are pure, their appearance attractive, and there is in them the religion and goodness, virtue, chastity, and submissiveness to the master, as if they had a natural bent for slavery. The Zanj women, on the other hand, have many bad qualities. The blacker they are, the uglier their faces, the more pointed their teeth, the less used they are, and the more likely to do some harm. For the most part, they are of bad character, and they frequently run away. There is no pleasure to be got from them because of their stench and the coarseness of their bodies. Even worse are the Zaghawa. They are worse than the Zanj and than all the black races. Their women are useless for pleasure, and their men are useless for service. Arab Muslim rulers, princes, and senior statesmen kept large numbers of concubines in harems, while the ordinary Muslim masses had fewer concubines who lived as part of their families. This practice ran across the Muslim world from West Africa to the Middle East and Turkey. When a concubine bore her master a child, especially a boy, then she became Walad, concubine mother, who could no longer be sold or transferred and became free upon the death of the master. The child also assumed the free status of the father, if the master so recognized it. Apart from instances whereby black slaves were used as breeders to ensure the constant supply of slaves, casual intercourse and marriage between black slaves was generally prohibited. Descendants of the age-old practice of concubinage in most Arab countries today regard themselves as black Arabs, black Moors, or even outright white Arabs, irrespective of their complexion. A good percentage of black slaves were used in plantation farming. Some of these include the indigo, sugar, and cotton plantations of 18th century northern Sudan and the clove plantations of Zanzibar. The jihadist emirates of western and central Sudan also employed vast numbers of slaves in large-scale agricultural farming. As already pointed out above, large numbers of the Zanj were employed on plantation farms in Iraq as early as the 8th century. In the Persian Gulf, slaves were used in the salt mining, fishing, and pearl diving industries. Ibn Butlan had this to say about the Zanj men. They can endure hard work. If the Zanj has had enough to eat, you can chastise him heavily and he will not complain. The Zanj and the Sudan men were regarded as best for the more physically exacting tasks, while Nubian men were regarded as trustworthy and used as doormen, guards, and financial assistants in Egypt and other parts of North Africa. Male black slaves were recruited into infantry groups and generally inferior roles to that of cavalry staffed by the Mamluks, slaves of mainly Turkish origin. Turkish military slaves became the best cavalry, and the best cavalry were Turkish military slaves. Africans were considered inferior to Turks. They were also stereotyped as infantry, which was inferior to cavalry. Therefore, African military slaves by color and occupation were considered of less importance than Turks. It was in this stereotyped role that thousands of black slaves perished in battles, during succession-related feuds and interracial feuds with the Berber and Turkish counterparts. Mention is made of the employment of black slaves as soldiers in considerable numbers at various times in Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, and India. The first recorded use of black slave troops is in Aghlabid, Tunisia, where they were used as a special corps by the ruling dynasty in the early 9th century to counterbalance the threat of Arab troops. Numerous black slave soldiers caught up in the bloody feuds of medieval Muslim North African rule were at various times slaughtered by the victorious parties. It was in this role that one or two of the offspring of black concubines took over the reins of power in Muslim North Africa and Muslim India, where the role of black African slaves in warfare and politics in the period 1400 to 1700 was considerable. A significant proportion of male black slaves were castrated and used in Muslim lands as eunuchs to guard their harems and serve as attendants at holy sites such as the Kaaba at Mecca and the Prophet's Mosque at Medina. They formed a special class of highly prized slaves kept by Muslim rulers and bourgeois from the heart of the Muslim world to Muslim Africa. Ethiopia was for a very long time the main source of eunuchs from the Muslim world, even though from the mid-18th century, Bagirimi became the main exporter. The operation, done on boys aged between 8 and 10, though prohibited under Islam, was carried out with an exceedingly high death rate. Gustav Nachtigal was told that, on the whole, about 30% survived the operation in Bagirimi, while other estimates put the mortality rate up to 80%. This barbaric act was made particularly cruel for black victims in that, in contrast to their white counterparts, whose operation did not deny them the ability to perform coitus, the castration of blacks involved what was popularly referred to as a level with the abdomen, i.e., a complete amputation of the genitalia. Some eunuchs came to hold positions of influence, and it was indeed only in this capacity as eunuchs that black slaves, unlike their white counterparts, were sometimes able to play political and judicial roles of some importance in Muslim lands. Hence, in the words of J.O. Hunwick, "It is a curious irony that while the female slave's best chance of a life of ease and respect was through the exploitation of her female sexuality, as a concubine, and ultimately as a mother, the male slave's surest road to prosperity and power lay in having his own sexuality sacrificed through a transformation whose physical and emotional pain can better be imagined than described." Muslim communities differed in their enthusiasm to convert their slaves to Islam. Nevertheless, a process of acculturation and conversion was almost inevitable. For as Ibn Khaldun observed, "It is always in the nature of the conquered and captured to imitate the lifestyles of their masters in their dress, insignia, belief, and other customs and usages." There is therefore no gainsaying that Muslim slaves, both without and within Africa, almost invariably adopted the Islamic way of life, at least by a second or third, if not first generation. Looking at the statistics of slave populations in Muslim areas in tropical Africa, detailed above, there is little doubt, therefore, that enslavement became a major means of converting Africans to Islam, both within and without the continent. The main means by which light-skinned Muslims introduced Islam to black Africans was through the institution of slavery. It was mainly as slaves that millions of Africans came into contact with Islam in such areas as North Africa, the Middle East, Turkey, and the Indian subcontinent. However, as Bernard Lewis observes, all in all, the cultural role of blacks in medieval Arab Islam was small and, as compared with the role of the Arabs, Persians, and Turks, of minor significance. It was primarily as slaves that they were imported to the Islamic lands, and it was as slaves of various kinds that they rendered their service to Islam. This assessment, in our view, is the most apt of the roles and general contribution of the descendants of the millions of black slaves taken into Muslim lands in the past 1400 years. And this takes us to another crucial aspect of Muslim slavery, i.e., the condition of slaves in Muslim lands. The condition of slaves in Muslim lands. Theory versus practice. Not a few leading Western travelers and scholars have been prone to expatiate on the mildness and humanity of Muslim slavery. The general theory has been that slaves, especially domestic slaves, were treated as well as any other family member by their Muslim masters, and that they were hardly ever treated harshly or discriminated against. Hence, there are those who have asserted that, in all fairness, a lot of slaves in Arabia must be compared to the lot of the average freeman in that country. The slave fares almost as well as his master, and generally the conditions under which they live in bondage are better than those prevalent in their native country. Others claim that the status of a slave in Islam and the favorable position he occupied often worked to his advantage. The slave generally formed a part of the household as much as any member, and through a mixture of fear and respect, a feeling of security and affection, he developed a sense of loyalty, which did not escape the notice of many a traveler. Some claim that the institution of slavery in Islam operated in such a way that the slave could advance within a given system, military, political, and even economic, according to his accomplishments and merit. There are even those who would go on to the extent of lauding the values of the institution of slavery in Islam as a house of humanitarian correction. As we have stated above, the Quran counsels but does not require the Muslim master to be mild in his treatment of slaves. Likewise, there are numerous other prophetic traditions that call upon Muslims to treat their slaves with kindness. One such tradition, claimed to be the last words of the Prophet, runs as follows: I advise you to pray and to act in a God-fearing way towards those whom your right hand possess, your slaves. The general theory of benign Muslim slavery is based mainly on two fundamental premises, i.e., the theoretical religious and legal propositions relating to these subjects and examples of a minuscule fraction of slaves who rose to positions of influence in the Muslim world. J. Comher, for instance, cites the accomplishments of individuals of African descent and culture, whom he refers to as immigrants rather than persons with slave origins, as evidence of the interracial and benign utopia of Muslim societies. What these claims fail to mention is that in contrast to the situation of the Mamluks, the Gelder's knife and the corps of eunuchs were virtually the only route by which a black could attain high office of any kind within the Muslim world outside Black Africa. Apart from isolated and rare examples of black eunuchs like Abu al-Miskafir, who captured the reins of power during an interregnum in the 10th century Egypt, and others like Du al-Nun al-Mizri, died 861, known as the head of Sufis, most, if not all other persons of black descent who attained some kind of fame in the Muslim world, mainly in poetry and music, were almost always the offspring of concubines. Looking at such rare examples against the fact that millions of blacks were taken into Muslim lands as slaves is yet another commentary on the condition of slaves in Muslim lands. Indeed, what the racial prejudice against blacks, as detailed above, suggests is that the various accomplishments of those very few people of African descent in the Muslim world were despite, not because of, a system that must have been very different from the alleged interracial and intercultural utopia of Muslim societies. The various accomplishments of such individuals should therefore be attributed to their own resilience and determination. Added to this is the fact that the contribution of people of black descent to Islamic civilization is either not acknowledged or is mentioned dismissively in Muslim historiography. A black Palestinian Muslim once told this writer he has never come across Bilal's name in any ismad or hadith and wondered why this was so. Most, if not all, proponents of the idea of idyllic Muslim slavery tend to highlight the various religious and legal stipulations on the treatment and manumission of slaves as proof of the magnanimity of Arab Islam, more than any other system, towards slaves. It is, however, one thing having these pious religious and ethical propositions, and another thing putting them into practice. Some modern Muslim apologists put together a selective collection of Quranic verses, hadith, pious sayings and stipulations from fiqh on the treatment of slaves and draw wild conclusions such as, during the short period in which slavery was tolerated by Islam, the Muslim institutions did not leave slaves under the hard circumstances which were spread in those days, and they had not deprived them of their human rights as other legislations had done. But the slaves enjoyed in Islam kind surveillance and good circumstances and gentle treatment as the outcome of the recommendations of the Prophet to his followers and according to the outlook of Islam. Talking about legislation and prophetic recommendations on the treatment of slaves as evidence of good circumstances and gentle treatment of slaves in Muslim hands is like pointing to the numerous anti-racism groups and laws in Western Europe as evidence of the absence of racism in Western society. On the contrary, one would suppose that teachings or sanctions against a given practice, rather than being proof of its absence, are strong evidence of its prevalence. It is therefore only reasonable to see the emphasis on the kind treatment of slaves in Islamic sources, with the exception of the Quran, whose teachings on the subject can be said to be a reflection of the situation in pre-Islamic rather than Islamic Arabia, as a strong indication of their harsh, if not cruel, treatment. But let us leave the theoretical propositions for a moment and look at examples of what took place in practice. In practice, the condition of first-generation and plantation slaves in Muslim lands was as harsh and cruel as any other such system, while successive generations of all slaves had to live under the weight and stigma of racial and social discrimination as outlined above. As early as the 9th century, the Zanj, according to the great Arab historian Al-Tabari, were employed in gangs of between 500 and 5,000 in the salt marshes of southern Iraq. Al-Tabari observes that the condition was extremely bad, and that they were literally pinned down there, hopeless and homeless. Their reward consisted of a few handfuls of meal. Their miserable condition led to several rebellions, the fiercest of which lasted for 15 years, from 868 to 883 CE. A 19th century eyewitness described the condition of slaves in the Persian Gulf regions as a dreadful thing. He went on to state that perhaps the worst part of the whole thing is the pearl diving. The stronger male slaves were chosen for the task. And before they dive for pearl oysters, a clip is put on their nose to prevent their breathing. Then they jump out of the boat, armed with a hammer and a light basket, and on coming to surface, pass the oysters into the boat. And after a whiff of air are sent down again. If they don't succeed in sending up a certain number of oysters, they get severely beaten. Before long, their lungs begin to give way, and then it is soon all over with them. A 20th century eyewitness described the same situation as a repulsive and dreadful thing. Men and women live on the level of animals. As little is spent on them as possible, they being regarded simply as pieces of equipment for pearl diving. It has equally been pointed out that slaves in North Africa in general, and Egypt in particular, worked naked on starvation rations and in the unbearable climatic conditions, as a result of which they died by the hundreds, if not thousands. Within tropical Africa itself, Muslim states and communities use slaves extensively in peasant and large-scale agricultural production. The condition of slaves throughout Muslim communities was anything but mild. In 1820, René Callier reported numerous slave-based plantations in the Senegambian region, where slaves lived in several small slave villages. Callier accompanied one of his Muslim hosts to his rice plantation and described the condition of the slave workers in the following words. The poor slaves work entirely naked, exposed to the heat of the burning sun. The presence of the master intimidates them, and the fear of punishment expedites the work. The women, who had little clothing, and their children tied to their backs. Reporting on massive Maraca slave desertions during the late 19th, early 20th centuries, one French administrator noted, "If the Maraca had treated their slaves with less stinginess in their food ration, and with more humanity in their customary relations, then escapes would have been less frequent." In Zanzibar, it is well known that slaves who advanced in age or became ill, and who were of no economic value, were left to fend for themselves, and most of them ended up destitute and starved to death. Some were brutally killed by their masters and their bodies thrown by the seaside. Among the 500 slaves discovered in the palace of the Sultan of Oman after his overthrow in 1970 were those who were mute and suffered from paralysis of the neck because they were forbidden, under pain of beating, ever to speak or raise their eyes from the ground. Another indication of the harsh conditions of black slaves in the Muslim world is the high death and low birth rates alluded to in Ibn Butlan's works, cited above, and mentioned by many other observers. Some people attribute this to natural causes like unfamiliar weather conditions and lack of immunity. But looking at the examples given above of the conditions of slaves in Muslim lands, it is not only plausible but imperative to look beyond natural causes and point to the general harsh conditions under which slaves lived, such as the inadequacy or indeed absence of coverings, and the meager rations of food in addition to the physical, emotional and psychological torment as the ultimate causes of the high death and low birth rates. The numerous slave revolts in Muslim lands going back to the Zanj rebellions in 8th and 9th century Iraq, down to 19th century slave uprisings in Zanzibar and several other parts of Muslim Africa, coupled with the numerous desertions by slaves of their Muslim masters, all serve to underline the fact that, on the whole, Muslim slavery was not as idyllic as some modern Western scholars and most Muslim apologists would have us believe. Indeed, even from those who did not deny that Arab slaves were far better off than their American counterparts, one hears, but that there was something wrong with their condition of life is clear from the high rate of mortality and the low rate of fertility. These high death and low birth rates are further factors explaining the disproportionately small numbers of the black diaspora in the Muslim world. Now returning to the theoretical stipulations, most of those who advance theoretical propositions on the treatment of slaves as the basis of the idyllic nature of Muslim slavery fail to mention the numerous other stipulations that in effect reduce the slave to nothing more or less than some property on the same level as animals and inanimate objects. For instance, in traditional Muslim jurisprudence, the slave can be sold, given as part of a dowry or a pious gift, or as a bequest by the master. In other words, they could be dispensed of as any other property. The master could put slaves to any task, hire them out, inflict corporal as well as other punishment on his slaves, and even put them to death. The bodily harm or murder of a slave by a master carried no specific punishment. Only when the harm was deemed to be without cause would atonement, kafara, be required of a master. While the murder of another Muslim is punishable by death in Islamic law, a free Muslim is not liable for the murder of a Muslim slave. According to classical Muslim law, slaves have no inheritant rights. In the contrary, their offspring along with their own properties are passed on as inheritance. They cannot make vows, marry, or sign contracts on their own. Their evidence is not admissible in court, and a slave's word against that of a freeborn person is null and void. As pointed out by Joseph Schacht, the counter-stipulations effectively made the protection of slaves in Muslim law not go beyond that of property in general. One is bound to ask, wherein then lie the human rights of slaves in Islam? The tradition recommending the manumission of Muslim slaves as an act of winning divine favor was effectively negated by the commentary of Muslim lawyers to the effect that almsgiving was preferable to freeing a slave, and that a mere affirmation of the unity of God will equally earn one God's favor. Hence, despite an elaborate system of manumission stipulated in traditional Muslim teaching, as we have shown above, the institution of slavery lasted longer in Muslim societies than any other society and indeed persists up to the present day. Again, we are faced with yet another example of practice being far off the mark of pious stipulations. Apart from the above-mentioned counter-stipulations that in effect vitiate the spirit of the pious recommendations, popular material such as songs and proverbs, which can be said to represent a fair reflection of contemporary attitudes, is also instructive about the condition of slaves in Muslim societies. A 19th century Darfur song entitled "The Slave's Lot" runs as follows. The slaves must do the work in the house. If they are unwilling to work, they must be beaten with the whip or must be beaten with the stick. Then they begin to cry and be willing to work. Their language is difficult. People don't understand them. Arab Muslim proverbs relating to slaves further throw some light on the general attitude towards slaves. One such slave proverb says, "The slave is beaten with the stick, and advice is sufficient for the freeborn." Another says, "Never trust a black slave, whip him well, and feed him well, and the work will be done. Dear to a slave is he who overworks him," says yet another proverb. Commenting on this last proverb, Al-Maydani explains that he who despises a slave and causes him fatigue is dearer to him than another, because his natural disposition is to bear humiliation. Thus, W.J. Serson points out that it may be a question of common attitudes and prejudice versus religious ethic. One is even inclined to think that these could be a reflection of common practices versus religious ethic and not just common attitudes and prejudice. The following are a few examples of Muslim Hausa slave proverbs. A slave is a slave for all that he is rich. A warning is for a free man, the stick for a slave. One man's slave is an aristocrat to another man's slave. Commenting on claims that slaves in Zanzibar were so comfortable they had no desire to be released from bondage, G.A. Akinola writes, "There is no denying the fact that Islam sought to liberalize the institution of slavery by restricting those who might be enslaved, by spelling out the legal right of slaves, and by recommending manumission in certain instances. In actual practice, however, neither the Islamic laws on slavery nor the obligations imposed on Muslim slave owners by their religious duties went sufficiently far to make slavery such an idyllic institution. from which slaves would never be constrained to seek escape. It should be intimated, though, that there can be no doubt that some individual Muslim masters treated their slaves well, whatever that means. Similarly, we do not by any means want to suggest that cruelty and harshness on the part of Muslim slavers was due to their Islamic religious persuasion. In fact, on the contrary, on balance, the spirit of traditional Muslim teaching is geared towards ameliorating the slave's condition. The point made, nevertheless, is that conclusions should not be drawn from theoretical stipulations or examples from individual kindness to give the impression that Muslim slavery as an institution was idyllic. This is because, just as the cruelty of Muslim slaves was by no means a Muslim or Islamic peculiarity, so should the so-called magnanimity of individual Muslim slavers, or even provisions and examples of manumission of slaves, not necessarily be treated as peculiarly Muslim or Islamic provisions. For kindness towards slaves could and has been found in many other slave-owning societies, while the principles and practices of manumitting slaves for religious motives were well known in Christian Byzantium and other slave-owning communities of antiquity. In this regard, Laymin Saneh's caution against conventional theories of benign Muslim slavery is very instructive. Caution is necessary in thus invoking the enlightened power of the law. For the slave dealer who suffered its reprimand for taking with left hand may offer generous ransom with the right and thus leave his critic without resources. The whole project became waterlogged with easy gain, and the bursts of humane sentiment we may get here or genuine kindness there were insufficient altogether to drain the swelling. In our view, a European missionary within the context of 19th century Malindi, Tanzania, has given an apt description of the condition of slaves in Muslim lands. The missionary, Charles New, admitted that slaves were not so hard driven in East Africa as they were, say, in America, but that the institution was nonetheless heartless and cruel. It was indeed the reign of terror. He went on to state rather succinctly that slaves were often treated with humanity upon the same principle that many men treat their horses kindly. In other words, Muslim slavers took good care of their slaves more out of economic considerations than fellow human feeling. Thus, good care of slaves was to the extent that it kept them performing their task for the slaver. The betterment of the lot of the slave under such circumstance was a byproduct. Apart from these, there remains a fundamental difficulty with the general thesis of the humanity and magnanimity of any institution of slavery. This difficulty was raised by David Livingstone with regard to the alleged kindness of Portuguese and Spanish masters toward their slaves. Livingstone wrote, "It is questionable whether a slave owner can be kind to those whom he robs of the first rights of humanity. There is in general no fellow feeling between the two classes. They repose no confidence in each other. The master invariably speaks disparagingly of the slaves as a class. They are blacks, beasts, etc. Particular individuals are pointed to as remarkable for having remained many years with their masters, as if it were implied that this is the exception, and a conviction existed in the mind of the master that the state of bondage was far from being an enviable one." An Arabic proverb says, "The freeborn man is a freeborn man, though harm befalls him. The slave is a slave, though you garb him in pearls." Abd al-Aziz ibn Ahmad al-Bukhari, died 1330, put it even more succinctly when he wrote that freedom is the attribute par excellence of a living being in secular jurisdiction, whereas slaves are in the category of the dead. The very status of the slave is therefore cruel. It is legal, social, and psychological death. Notwithstanding the convictions of past Muslim and Christian slavers that slavery was a blessing in disguise to the victims, the above statements indicate that even slavers were under no illusion whatsoever that slavery was a dreadful condition. No stipulation or magnanimity of individual slavers could make this hideous institution one to be lauded, more so when it is sanctioned and perpetuated in the name of God. Conclusion. What we have tried to establish in this chapter is, first of all, that slavery in Africa should be understood as having three broad dimensions. First is indigenous slavery, which ancient African societies shared with other ancient human societies such as Europeans, Americans, Arabs, and Asians. This form of slavery, we established, was incidental and marginal to society. The second dimension is the form of slavery inspired by the Western Christian civilizations, i.e., the large-scale transformations of the practice in 18th and 19th century non-Muslim African states, such as Ashanti and Dahomey, which were in league with European traders and slavers. Then we identified the third dimension, which constituted the primary focus of this work, in the form of Arab Islamic-inspired forms of slavery, as practiced by Muslims of all races and shared by African Muslim societies long before the European interlude. We then outlined the traditional Muslim understanding and justification for enslavement, i.e., non-belief in Islam. In addition to the content of their beliefs, Black Africans were further placed under the burden of a mythological curse, which fettered them to the perpetual servitude on account of the color of their skin. Thus, we demonstrated that, contrary to the conventional theories of the egalitarian spirit of Islam, light-skinned Muslims are just as color-conscious and racist as any other modern, light-skinned society. Racial discrimination against Africans and people of African descent in medieval Muslim sources and modern light-skinned Muslim societies are just as endemic. We then outlined how Muslims, from the pious to the nominal, within and without Africa, waged jihad, raided, hunted, kidnapped, and purchased tens of millions of Africans as slaves, and in the process slaughtered and caused the death of tens of millions of others. We established that contrary to theories of a humane Muslim slavery, the institution and practice of slavery in Muslim societies was as cruel and harsh as any other slave system. We established that notwithstanding pious Muslim stipulations about slavery, slaves constituted a class of deprived people with the chains of servitude and caste inferiority riveted on their offspring. They were totally denied civil status, and their exclusion from responsible office was reinforced by the entire weight of Islamic law, Muslim social practice, and traditional stigma. Numerous slave revolts, dating as far back as the Zand Rebellion in the 9th century, high death and low birth rates among slaves in Muslim lands, desertions and countless attempts at desertion, all belie the theory of idyllic Muslim slavery.